Hello, welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and Mike Buhl is joining me here. So we'll go right to that story, which you were just telling me 5 minutes
Okay,
ago, but
good.
you have to repeat it here
Yeah,
regarding the use of e-fuels that you were watching in a German TV show.
yeah, Anne Will. Uh, Erstes Deutsche Fernsehen, which is the first channel. And this was a discussion actually between several guests of the show. And she usually has a good mix of, guests, both people that are on the left or people on the right. And in this case, there was a proposal by one of the FTB politicians that we could use e-fuels as something alternative to going fully electric. And I wasn't sure at first what he was talking about, so I did, some research. E-fuels is not the same thing as like biofuels or this E85 stuff that we have come to used to. It's really artificial, like synthetic fuel, where they use sustainable technologies to produce it. And Porsche right now apparently has a plant in Chile where they're making this stuff. But the problem is the cost to make it exceeds the cost of regular gasoline uh, price. And so it apparently is carbon neutral, but we were talking, that we're not sure about this e-fuel. If it's a gimmick, if it's to be trusted, um, and if we can mass produce it, and then the question of is also of is it affordable alternative,
So e-fuels, I guess it means electric fuel, and on the Porsche website it says it's made from water and carbon dioxide using wind energy.
Yeah.
And then they have, I think, a photo of like one of the windmills. And I must assume, like, so if you have the windmills that produces the electricity, and that electricity is probably fed
I get the idea. It's kind of like
into the
artificial
e-car.
oil. Yeah, artificial, but it's artificial so that you can, reduce the carbon emission side. And if you have an artificial way of producing such fuels, it would be kind of like fake gasoline, but the
Well,
engine
see, is
wouldn't.
it still like a liquid? So you put a
Yeah.
liquid in your car, and
Mhm.
then does it still have a combustion engine? I mean, is it about the combustion
Apparently,
process?
it's combustion engine friendly. Uh, and that's what the claim was made by the politician. I was very carefully listening to this proposal, and I was trying to think of, how well would this work with combustion engines? And some cars, they have done E85 and some of the biofuels where we know it damages the some of the engines. But they were saying that Porsche, which is a big German company, that they were basically experimenting with this. Now, we all know Porsche is a luxury car brand. So the worry that I have that this is exclusively kind of recreational, kind of upper classy car driving. It's not for your average commuter, at least from what I can tell, and it's not mass produced yet. So apparently they don't have enough to transport it massively.
So they would
So
ration it for rich people effectively. I mean, you could have like a very high cost of
yeah, I
obtaining the
think
fuel.
it's for Porsche, so they will have a monopoly over this fuel unless they're probably going to patent it, and they're going to be issues with but yeah, so I'm a little skeptical when I heard this proposal, but you always should give someone has an alternative solution to anything with oil and gas combustion, uh, and then electric cars we know are also very expensive for the common.
But isn't that how all of the innovation starts, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you make it expensive at the beginning, because you're just figuring it out, right? I mean, and you need a lot of make a lot of trial and error, and you need to figure out whether something is technically feasible. And then as you keep experimenting and you keep making the product better, you add cheaper input material. And then that's the way how you can, over time, reduce the cost of, for instance, those e-fuels, and then eventually maybe everybody can use it. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
that's definitely, yeah. I That's the position of at least in the German political debate of the Greens. The Greens would say, and if there was that guest on the show who was a member of the Green Party, he made a similar argument like you just made, that the cost and risks if we do nothing will just get worse and worse. And so it's going to be costly, to transition. So we'll have to subsidize some things, and the state will have to make investments. There'll have to be some kind of tax incentives to get into these alternative,
Now on the
ways.
website, they make the argument that it is, zero carbon,
Right.
um, to use e-fuels. I mean, how much of it is the truth, right? I mean, because I
And
mean,
it's
if they
located in
say,
Chile too, right? Chile, so that should also kind of just think of the difficulty of transporting it out of Chile. So are they going to have it like in trucks, or I'm assuming these are going to be electric trucks, so that the point is if they produce this e-fuel, they obviously are a company that wants to make profits. So there's that question too, the scarcity of the fuel, and then uh, money making, and right, then we have another Tesla company, right? Basically.
yeah, I
So
mean, if you're using wind energy, so
mhm.
across the entire life cycle of the windmill, I would say it is low carbon, but it's not exactly zero carbon because in order to produce the windmill, the turbines, the some of the, I guess, minerals that you need in order to build them. That could be, there's some, as long as you have some mining operation, I think there's always some carbon that's being used up just to power the equipment for the mining. So I'm not sure whether it's going to be zero carbon, but I think reducing
Yeah,
carbon, I
there's a
think that's
little
probably.
greenwashing. Would you agree? Uh, just from what I'm reading, we don't know for sure because the information is still very scarce. And again, I just watched this on a show, and it was just presented. But I did do research, and I was looking at the like you're watching, looking at the Porsche website, that there is a plant being built in Chile, and they are producing it apparently, small amounts. So how this will get bigger, and what if other car makers will try something similar, or if it's just a Porsche thing.
Well,
Um,
yeah, the important piece of context is that Chile is a mining state, right? I mean, a lot of the lithium that we are, and I believe copper too, that we are requiring for the e-car transition, um, it- they are drawn from the mines in Chile, and I suspect that the state level regulations that are in place um, are much
Lots,
less
yeah.
strict than in the developed countries, and that's probably why, like, rich countries, companies, they like to source
Outsource
their
it there.
minerals to countries like Chile,
Yeah,
um, or
it's
sub-Saharan Africa.
it's definitely in the periphery, maybe, well, semi-periphery, right? If you locate where Chile's located, so maybe it's just a reason that they want to produce it there, and it's easy for them. But like you said, yeah, there's probably some profit motive that I can imagine.
Yeah, I had one of my colleagues who was studying the indigenous population in Chile, the so-called Mapuche people, and they're, I think, less than 10% of the Chilean population. They were the indigenous population, so before the Spaniards settled the country, and there have been continuous disputes. I mean, part of it has to do with culture, right? So like adopting the Spanish language, Spanish traditions, and so forth. And then basically the claim towards cultural autonomy. But then I think the heart of the conflict is about land usage, right? So because
Mhm.
these are rural populations, so they tend to inhabit the spaces where the mining companies would usually set up their operations. And the reason why the mining companies are able to go in and set up their mines is because the state backs them up, right? So you would usually be, well, the state would. So at the beginning, like when the colonization started, it was kind of friendly, right? So they were just saying, okay, we have this small limited space that we demarcate for the mining, right? Um, and then the rest of the land, you get to stay where you are. Um, but then, of course, over time, I mean, the mining companies, they need more land, so they want to explore more fields, and then gradually the state kind of
Tolerates it.
yeah, it's like circumscribes. I mean, like they don't throw out the people completely because they need to live somewhere, but there is a displacement process that's going on, right?
Do you remember that accident that happened in Chile with the miners being trapped, and there was just risks that were continuously taken with old mines, and they made a movie out of it. They had to get the miners out. I believe it was Chile. They made a movie out of this, and this neglect of yeah working conditions and just really exploiting the mines that are extremely old, right? So there's sometimes these companies that still are trying to go into these old mines that are really risky, and then it happens, there's accidents, right? So with the extraction of such you know
Yeah, well, that's
uh,
the labor practices. I think that's another big area to look at. I mean, I was watching the podcast with Siddharth Kara, and he's supposed like a human rights activist slash journalist, and I believe he was writing this very long report about the cobalt mining in Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And yeah, it's quite a harrowing account because child labor is legal over there. So you actually see a lot of children, probably at primary school age, working in those mine shafts. And then yeah, and then there are and also because it's quite toxic. Because if you work in mining, you have these fumes, from whatever the cobalt mining, uh, that uh, that they inhale, and then I remembered a report of an older guy who had like this big swelling, like he had this big lump on his throat, which I mean I must assume it's some form of malignant tumor or some kind of cancer, that like a lifetime exposure to the cobalt mine has produced. Um,
deadly work, right? Very deadly work.
and then of course it's dangerous because you could have, mine shaft collapses. There's no, real labor safety standards that are in place. So yeah, and it is very, very low, payment of wages. But if you think about the operations of the global economy, specifically the iPhone, which is, the product that we're using everywhere over here, um, you couldn't build smartphones without cobalt, right? So therefore, you need the cobalt mining. Um, so the difficult situation that we're in is that, you could say the wealth of nations, to paraphrase Adam Smith, is in fact built on, you know, you could say low paid wage labor that verges on slavery, right? Um,
Definitely, yeah.
and yeah, but that's, yeah, cobalt mining in Congo. That's one of the sore areas of
Yeah.
globalization. Um, Quite a dark
Side,
one.
yeah, the side effects of globalization. And Larry, I sometimes do watch YouTube videos, and our listeners, sometimes you can put in YouTube the hardest jobs in the world, the toughest jobs. Uh, and they often have these scenes of workers in Indonesia walking up volcano, getting sulfur, and literally walking it back down the volcano. And this is, very manual, straining work on the physical body. So the body, it starts to take a toll. So we know that in the global south, like you said, there's a lot of these jobs that are horrible and life-threatening. They're often deadly.
Sulfur is some kind of input resource to something else, I must assume.
Yeah, yeah. I actually sometimes screen or show parts of a documentary in my sociology classes called "Working Man's Death" by the Austrian filmmaker named Michael Klavocker, who died, I believe, in the field in Liberia. He caught malaria. But one of his films, he literally walks up together with these sulfur workers that go up this mountain in Indonesia, which is also a tourist site. So that's ironic. It's at the same time a workplace, but also tourists go there to take pictures. A lot of Western tourists and tourists around the region. But to cut the story short, people have to have masks because the sulfur is so toxic and so deadly to their lungs. It literally decays, it destroys their lungs. And the life expectancy for some of these sulfur workers is a lot less because, it destroys their lungs. And then are also on high altitudes. So, you have all sorts of health problems. But it's quick cash for them. So a lot of them do it because it is quick cash. It's, how much weight you basically bring down the mountain, and how much weight then transfers into what you make, right? So you have all age groups that do it. Uh, and it's one of those deadly jobs, it's just carrying sulfur up and down. Um, so that's one example, but there's probably, hundreds of other examples. Street vendors in Mumbai, like you said, some of the mining that occurs in Africa with children, and in, like you said, South America.
Well, street vendors, I would consider it a stressful job. I mean, I'm not sure whether
Yeah,
it is risky. I mean, is it about like
like
getting robbed
informal.
or something?
Yes, there's a lot of informal work. Um, that exists, as we know, in the developing world, in the global south. So informal, can be just about anything. I mean, somebody selling fruit, there could be potential guides, people that lead Western tourists towards the slums, as slum tour guides, for instance. It could be selling tourist items. It could anything food related services, taxi. But it often involves children. It involves people of different age groups. So yeah, less regulations, a lot less regulation when it comes to informal work, right? So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, those are, labor relationships that are clearly, unstable. And obviously we have that, you know, going on even, in the Western developed countries for sure. I mean, um, it's just that, the, in the rich countries, the overall standard of living is substantially higher. So, even somebody who, is, I don't know, Uber delivery driver or street vendor, has usually some kind of, healthcare benefits. I mean, maybe not so much in the US, but I think in the European countries, I think that, or in Canada, I think that's, sort of like a national insurance standard that, gives at least some amount of protection to the broader population. Yeah, there's this blog post that I'm working on right now, that's not directly related to the labor situation, but so I'm writing now about homelessness.
mhm.
Because just anecdotally, I mean, I was in Philadelphia recently to, usually go to the accountant, do some tax business, and so I have to take the subway because my family's up in the suburbs, and I noticed that there were quite a few homeless encampments, like tents, that were set up close to the subway stops. And those would be in the rundown neighborhoods. If you uh, go past, like, I would say Kensington, Frankfurt area, which is more the lower income area, and you go closer to Girard, closer to the center city in Philadelphia, you start seeing the neighborhood change. So you see a lot of new buildings, so like gentrified, like condominiums and like high-rise buildings and things like that. And those did not exist like 10 years ago, so before the wave of gentrification, when I first came to Philadelphia. But anyways, yeah, so there you won't see as much of the homeless encampments, but certainly in the more rundown neighborhoods, you do see, you do see the homeless tents, and also, the drug addicts, right? Which is oftentimes a correlated problem, I think. So I looked up the statistics at the Housing Urban Development Department, where they do a very comprehensive survey of the homelessness crisis in the country, and they find that 50% of the homeless population struggles with substance abuse in some way. So it's usually alcohol or opioids, very commonly now. Fentanyl deaths have been skyrocketing, so we're at 70,000 deaths uh,
National.
nationally 2 years ago. And then for
Wow.
all opiate deaths, it's about 106,000. So you can already tell that more than two-thirds of the deaths are traceable to fentanyl. Um, Fentanyl is very sneaky because it doesn't take a lot. It's 2 grams to kill people. And it can be mixed with other drugs that's seemingly innocuous, including things like, you know, um, like heroin or meth, um,
Hmm.
or sometimes even marijuana. I mean, so there's a lot of
I've been
um,
following it.
common
I've been
drugs.
following it. Yeah. Serious development. Definitely. And you're saying that there's a large percentage of the homeless population that is also affected by it. If you give me a minute, I have two books I wanted to show. It's on that issue. One is called, let me see, Tent City Urbanism. This was actually present my brother gave me that, as everybody, most people know, I'm really interested in sort of informal housing and but this is called Tent City Urbanism by Andrew Heben. And this is actually taking a view of, like you said, encampments, homeless encampments, uh, from a perspective of homeless activists. So this guy, he's actually an organizer, I believe, in Washington State, and how some of these encampments often get negative stigma, and they're seen as dumping grounds, but some of them can be actually very nicely organized if the city allows it, and if they're sanctioned encampments. Sometimes there's non-sanctioned, those are the ones that are like illegal and who knows what's going on. But there's something with sanctioned encampments where they have some structure or order, and they will boot out people that just do drugs all day. So that's one of the reasons I'm going to recommend this book to my listeners, and maybe even you, Larry. It's actually quite good. 10 City Urbanism, from self-organized camps to tiny house villages. Publisher is the Village Collaborative. And then there's another one. This they got another one, and I haven't actually read this one yet. I have went through this one. Nights in Tents on the Front Lines of the Occupy Movement. Right. So this again takes a kind of political direction, a political uh, point of view. Uh, Political activists that start to occupy and are in front of banks, or that was big. What was it, like 6, 7 years ago, or 10 years?
So I guess my question is like, so what is the
Yeah.
objective of the homeless activists, right? So is it about
Mhm.
yeah, challenging the city government to create more affordable housing, so regular housing structures, or but it seems to me that what you are suggesting in your summary of the research
Yeah.
is that the objective is to sustain those homeless encampments, um,
That's,
and
that's kind of subversive. Yeah, you could argue some of those organized homeless encampments are subversive by nature. Uh, and people do it on purpose, and they know they might, be sanctioned and often get bulldozed by the city. So sometimes they are really well organized from within. So if they do get evicted from city property, they may move a couple of 100 yards to the next location. So that actually happened here in Dallas. There was eviction, and then homeless encampments. They sort of moved. Uh, so some of these are sometimes well organized, but sometimes they're not. They don't have a structure. They're very unorganized, and they may not even have any political principles or political ambitions. But I think I've noticed that some of the books that are written are coming from this area in Portland and in Washington, where there's a lot more political organization trying to organize homeless people and tent dwellers, uh, and try to, like, get the city to provide them safe spaces and allow them to sanction some homeless encampments that become legalized, at least, temporarily. And there's some conditions that cities will allow it, but they'll have conditions, sanitation, stuff like that. Some cities may even offer internet access or provide toilets and stuff like that. So that was actually in Dallas too. There was this porta potty. Uh, the city was spending money on porta potties around areas where there were lots of homeless
where the
encampments.
idea is to reduce the open defecation. So
Exactly.
um,
Yeah.
because
It
obviously,
was.
like if you go in that area, like if you're a tourist, you're not gonna go there if it stinks, right?
Yeah.
Um,
A real hazard. It was a real sanitation issue. But I believe that program has expired last time I checked, but it only lasted for a year. Uh, the city provided porta potties. But other cities, I don't know, other Seattle and Portland or even New York, I don't know what the cities do, and they have their own departments within the city structure, city council, or they have some initiative, homeless.
Okay, so now if I imagine that I'm a mayor, I mean, and I would presumably be a capitalist mayor because obviously the powers that be wouldn't put me in the job unless I was sufficiently capitalist. I
Mhm.
would be very concerned about programs like the ones you mentioned to facilitate the like to treat homeless camps not as a sort of temporary solution to you know current inability to afford rent for regular housing, but rather as a permanent site where um, you're not basically paying taxes to the city, so which of course as a city mayor you're very concerned about that, um, and also um, like what is the signal effect that it has, let's say on
Like a moral hazard, you mean?
yeah the middle class residents in your city
Yeah.
who don't want to see that. I mean, they would
Oh
probably
yeah,
move out to the
this is
suburbs.
definitely businesses are opposed and middle class residents are opposed. And this usually drives lots of people to city council. Uh, and then there's usually sanctioning of homeless encampments. And there's a lot of businesses that suffer. That is true. So there is a class divide, I would argue, and but you can see it play out in city council meetings if you ever watch. There's sometimes they're live. Every city has city council meetings, and for several like years, I would sometimes watch Seattle city council meetings because I was so interested in the homeless situation in Seattle, which was epic. I mean, it was just chaotic. And you can definitely see different sides and different claims that different groups have, including homeowners, businesses, and then activists. And it became a definitely big debate. There was different sides that formed. Um, but it became more visible, I think, in cities where they had serious issues of homelessness, and so homeless encampments, if was sometimes if they're sanctioned, they're tolerated and they're clean, then maybe more people accept them. But if they are unsanctioned and if they are not clean, or what I mean by not clean, like sanitation and all that, then residents will probably, not go with it. Including, I think, in Seattle, it became a problem because people were camping out in the parks, and that's where a lot of middle class people, do their recreation or whatever, and homeless people were camping out in the parks. So then they had to look for another location. People were moving, uh, camping out in the parks, public parks. Uh, that was a similar issue actually in Dallas. In Dallas, there was also this issue of some people were attempting to camp out in parks, and so then they restricted that. It became tougher. So they have like times that you had to leave, or if the park is only open till 11 p.m. or something. Right.
Right. I think
So
so.
yeah,
I go back to this issue of like the motivation
yeah,
of the homeless population because it seems to me what you're suggesting is that there is some kind of political agenda there, or where the idea is, well, we are resisting the compulsion to its commodification, right? Because basically by escaping the rental market, right, which is a huge um, cost barrier, especially for low income people, right? And by the way, I was shocked by the statistic also that a
yeah.
sizable chunk, I mean, maybe a little bit less than half the homeless population is in the workforce. Actually, they are working regular jobs. But in any case, so yeah, if like if there was sort of like like a philosophical uh, position that these homeless people had about basically, you could say, anti-capitalism, anti-commodification, that sort of idea. Um, but I have a feeling that for for most of the homeless population, I think it's not a lifestyle choice. I mean, it sounds to me like there is something bad that has happened in their lives, and for some reason or another, they were not able to cope with that psychologically. So, like for instance, they had a divorce, and then that totally shocked them, and they couldn't focus on their work. So then they take the prescription drugs, and then they buy opioids from shady dealers, and then they get hooked on the drugs, and then they stop working, and then they cannot pay the rent, and then they lose the home.
Yeah.
And then once they're in a homeless encampment and they see that basically every other homeless neighbor, quote unquote, is also a drug addict, and then of course is not good because it sort of normalizes the idea that that addiction is the only way to be, or
You
is the
mean
proper way to be.
like as reference groups, bad reference groups start to reinforce this lifestyle? Is that what you're
Yes,
getting
and it's
at?
clearly so because again, you go back to the statistic that 50% of homeless with substance abuse issues, and I think 80% of the homeless population has ever had an experience with substance abuse. Um, that to me suggests that, I guess this is my guess, that the vast majority of the homeless population is put in that situation involuntarily, not through a conscious choice to be in that situation. And therefore, I think societally, I think we can and we should be treating it as a problem that needs to be solved. Um, Now, I mean, if again, for the people who have like the political viewpoint, the anti-commodity crowd,
Mhm.
um, maybe I might be open-minded to that. Actually, I mean, I think there's something seemingly attractive to that idea. But I have a feeling that most people are there involuntarily, um, and they cannot dig themselves out of that
Yeah.
unless there's a lot of effort to steer against that. I mean, so just one anecdote. I mean, that I also recount in the blog. When I was sitting in the subway, there was this one um, junkie that was sitting behind me, and he was having a conversation with the person right across from him, who was a social worker.
Yeah.
And the social worker was very patient, very kind-hearted, and was trying to get that junkie to seek help, like basically drug rehabilitation center or something like that. And then both of them left the train, and I didn't follow up. But
Yeah.
like there has to be at least some kind of positive messaging, right? That that if you are, you know, doing substance abuse, there's at least some positive stories, some positive encounters that you get. Um, because I mean, if you think about like middle class people, I mean, they constantly get affirmation in some way, right? By family members or by the peer group, by coworkers, who from time to time say, "Yeah, good job," well done with that report, or um, getting a hug from their
Support
child or
groups.
something like that.
Support groups.
Yeah, support groups. I mean, they think of things that maybe the the housed population, right? So which is
Yeah.
the normal population, you could say. has, and maybe if you're homeless, you might not have a lot of these positive experiences. Um, there's issues with violence, right? Where basically like, and also theft, right? Because you everything you possess is in a shopping cart and in a tent, right? Which can easily be stolen.
Yeah.
Um, if you're a female homeless person, there's a problem of rape from basically other homeless men. Um, so I basically I just wanted to
No, I
make it
can add
clear that
on.
it's
I
not
mean,
great.
you're right on point, and this is definitely more complex than we often think of it. And there's so many different entry points in a discussion of homelessness and camps and why people do it. What's the phenomenon? If it's structure, if it's agency, if there's some individuality, individual effect. Uh, One thing I'm going to recommend, actually, I remember citing this when I did research for my dissertation. It was related topic, which is squatting, urban squatters. This Dutch sociologist named Hans Brugget, and he wrote an article called "The Logic of Urban Squatting." And he basically creates typologies of the different types of squatters. Now, I would attribute this to sometimes different types of homeless encampments, or maybe homeless strategies. Why people, may sometimes uh, for what reasons, some people blame it on psychological reasons, like I think you keep mentioning drugs. And then there's also the lack of affordable housing. So there's all these different entry points that people may use, domestic violence. Then there's maybe also sometimes undocumented people who don't have a status. We see this phenomenon with refugees that arrive sometimes in Europe, when they fall through the cracks and then they're homeless because of statelessness, right? Now, what I wanted to do real quick, is he mentioned like four to five, and really you can find this on a Wikipedia page if you put in Hans Purgit, and I just pulled it up. So he had five, and just hold on just a second. I want to make sure that I get it right. The five that he mentions, different types. Why somebody you think of homelessness as a last, you know, that people become homeless because of deprivation, right? Real economic deprivation. There are people that really are affected because they are affected because of job loss, unemployment. So we could call that deprivation-based homelessness if you want. There's another one he calls homelessness as alternative housing strategy that may not be based on deprivation, but sometimes people are seeking alternative housing. Okay, that's the third one. Uh, Entrepreneurial, that there's a business aspect involved. Maybe saving money, if people crash in a van somewhere and camp out there for a couple of months, maybe it is an economic thing. Like they may even charge other people. And there's sometimes business aspects. Okay. What's the other one? Conservational. That has to do with a lot of the hippies and a lot of the environmentalists sometimes engage in political activity that they are in tents and encampments. So think of like the Occupy movement, and I would even put tree squatters. And that actually happened in Germany. In Germany, there was this little town where all these youth left-wing activists literally squatted in the little town, and they were forced evicted by the police. So sometimes there's some of this intentional homelessness to create attention, in the media. And then the last one is just pure political type. And I like I said, in some of the cases, like you go up to Seattle, there's embeddedness, I think, with activists, political activists, and then they also embed themselves with regular homeless people. So I think sometimes there's this mixture. Like you could have political activists that they themselves are not homeless, but they are trying to be advocates for the homeless, right? So that could happen. I could see that we have to differentiate, and this is on a global north level. The global south, that is another can of worms. I think in the global south, you're probably going to have more of this deprivation, poverty reason, for this massive homelessness, especially if there's, just no money and the economy is really bad, right? Or like an earthquake, like Turkey, when that happened. I mean, I could imagine that could result in massive homelessness and people living out in tents, right?
Yeah,
But
I
I
mean,
like this model he has. I like this model. I think it's workable. I briefly reframed it just a little bit, but for our listeners, and you too, Larry, I think it's practical because there are some typologies that wouldn't fit in all situations of homelessness. Now again, he was talking about squatting, but I think there's parallel, especially some homeless encampments. Sometimes there's recreational kind of homeless encampments where they are just like I think in I don't know where it's located in Arizona, Slab City, USA. You might want to look that one up. It's real old hippies that just live in this abandoned place, and for them it's like a lifestyle thing. Uh, and it's somewhat just living out in the free. Some of them are anarchists, but they're mostly just doing it for recreation, and they have their RVs there. But they are technically, homeless encampment. They don't have, and they're squatting too. So, Slab City, USA. You want to look that one up.
okay, so for me, in my mind, it seems to me I have like three buckets here. So you could
Uh,
be ideologically homeless,
uh,
you could be poverty homeless, right? So you lack the money, and then you could be, you
Alternative.
know, well, you could be circumstantially
Okay.
homeless, which is basically about, you know, substance abuse, or it's about, divorce, or it's about some conflict in the family.
Situation. That
It's
sounds
about,
good.
yeah, poor mental health or whatever. So and there could be an overlap between all of these three. Now, if most of the people are in the second and the third camp, um, poverty and the circumstantial, um, you know, there is a recipe to solve it from the city planner perspective, right? The second group might be even the easiest to address because, um, well, I guess easy, but I mean, you could loosen the zoning laws, right? You could attract investors, or even better, you could just raise the taxes and then you can build public housing, right? Um, but as long as you increase the supply of housing massively, that would push the rents down and to levels that most low income people could afford it, and then you would basically eliminate that second group of the poverty homeless, right? Um, Now, for those that are in bad unique circumstances, I think you need to have something in addition. You would need um, basically like mental health care, like counseling, psychologists, things like that. So there's a very, you know, drug rehab clinics. There's a very complex infrastructure that probably has to be built on top of the housing first strategy, right? Where the idea is you provide housing first and then you try to solve their associated problems later. I think it can be quite effective actually,
Yeah. Well,
because a lot of the problems that come from being homeless, like for instance hanging out with violent and addicted neighbors, um, those negative circumstances, you won't face them if you have your own uh, home, your own apartment. Um, Now, okay, for the first group, right? So this is, I think this is, I think
Deprivation,
for no, no,
survival.
the first group, I call them the ideological group. So these are people who are anti-commodity, right? They believe that the capitalist model of extracting rent is um, bad, foolish, right?
Mhm.
And they're so ideologically committed to squatting, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that group, I so I really want to see the numbers. I really want to see like a rigorous survey done about
No,
the
definitely.
percentage of the homeless population that is strictly ideologically motivated, right? Um, my guess is that it's going to be a fairly small group of all of the homeless population. But that group, of course, as a city planner, there's not much you can do, right?
Yeah.
Um, I mean, like if somebody really, denied cooperation with the, whatever the norms of capitalist economy, um, in a free society, there's not much you can do. I mean, right? I mean, you can evict them from time to time, but they'll come back again. They'll still exist, right? You don't want to, impose too strict vagrancy laws because then you're just shifting
For
the
loitering laws.
homeless population into the prison system.
Yeah.
And, it's not like we don't have enough prisoners in America. In fact, we have the biggest prison population in the world. Now it's been turning around the last 10 years or so, I think, by relaxing the marijuana laws. I think we could um, relieve some pressure from the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
Um, but but yeah, but then but I'm also so marijuana legalization. I think I could be convinced of that. But then if it's like harder drugs, like the meth, heroin, and yeah,
That's a
uh,
big no-no.
crack, yeah, or fentanyl, I think, yeah, these are poisonous substances. I mean, if like so I'm also in favor of gun control, by the way, right? Especially semi-automatic rifles. I think and automatic rifles should be banned. But in the same way, I think that if you have harsh drugs that could, even in small quantities, basically kill or paralyze you. Oftentimes, the killing happens through the respiratory uh, arrest, right? People stop breathing, or the heart stops beating, right? So that to me sounds unacceptable. Now, but if you keep it illegal, right? There's obviously also a cost to that, right? Because you are, yeah, again, the prison industrial complex, the correctional facilities, the court systems, right? The lawyers, the judges, the
Monetary.
cops. I mean,
Yeah.
the entire apparatus is being fed, which I'm not sure whether it's the best use of society's resources. Um, yeah, and yeah, there's this idea that like, well, what if you keep um various drugs legal, but then you tax it heavily? Um, that's a potential approach. Um, but if you set the tax rate extraordinarily high, you're not deterring the black market, right? So if you have the legal drug, it's very expensive, but it could be clean, right? Because it would fall under the FDA regulations and the supervision of the government. Um, so you're not going to have deaths in that sense. Um, but if the price is extraordinarily high, then you still have the incentive for the uh, for the black market version, which of course is unregulated, where you could have relatively mild drugs, so to speak, that are laced with fentanyl, which is deadly, right? Um, And it's a real bit. So I looked at the numbers of the fentanyl seizure. I mean, we're talking about uh, several tens of thousands of tons of fentanyl that have been seized by the border patrol.
Yeah.
And that's been the number keeps going up, right? So they capture more and more of it. But it seems to me that given the scale of the fentanyl deaths, that's there's still a big chunk that gets through the border, and that certainly requires massive crackdown for sure. Um, but
Yeah.
then you're feeding the prison industrial complex, right? So I don't have the magic wand on that one, right?
Larry, do you think that this fentanyl addiction abuse is linked with increasing despair and people looking for ways to cope with it? Uh, I remember that there was, I think it was Wendy Brown, the scholar. She wrote this book on the deaths of the despair deaths, that rose the last 10, 15 years in rural areas, but deaths of despair. I think that's what it's called. That drug addiction is a symptom also of, you know, people maybe lacking an employment or lacking an opportunity where they think there's an opportunity in their life. And then a drug addiction becomes this, way to cope or way to deal with it. Do you think there's something there that this addiction of despair thesis, I guess that's what they call it, that it's despair, victimization that drives people to do these drugs and the easy access, I guess, to, the supply of it. Think there's something there?
Yeah.
Uh,
So there's the book that you refer to, I think, by Angus Deaton and Case Deaton.
Long
So
author.
they're
Okay.
Princeton couple actually, and they yeah they basically they documented the trend in opiate addiction, but also things like alcohol poisoning, which is connected with that.
Suicides.
Yeah, suicides. Which comes. Um, so in their view, I mean, so they have a very economic explanation. I think it boils down to deindustrialization and the uh, the lack of social status, especially among white middle-aged men. That's sort of the main group. Um, but I don't know. So if you look at the life expectancy statistics that the CDC puts out, the last 3 years, I want to say, so the three pandemic years that we've had since 2020, um, the numbers actually quite atrocious. I mean, we lost, um, I want to say, almost 2 years of life expectancy on average, which is quite bad. So I mean, I think now we're like 75, 76 or something. Um, which well, what does that mean? I mean, the lowering of life expectancy by 2 years. I mean, it means that there's a lot of people that are lower than that life expectancy threshold. Let's say 77 or something, right? Um, who passed away. So you have excess mortality for the group that's younger than 77. And that means that that's the impact of COVID, right? So people are so is it not now the issue is like, are they dying from COVID? The answer is yes. So most of the deaths are attributable to COVID infection. But then you also have the death of despair that's also mixed into these excess mortality figures. So let's say if died from alcohol or drug poisoning,
Or suicide,
um,
right?
or suicide, um, in the last few years during the pandemic, and it could be related to the extraordinary measures that were taken, like the public health measures, like lockdowns, things like that. Um, where I mean, so most people, I think, they can weather shocks like that because you can maybe retreat to your, you know, like the people that live in your like in your household, like your family members, right? You sort of get closer together, or you still try to Zoom with your friends, or you meet them later on as soon as the economy opens up again, right? Um, and that would probably be okay for most people. Um, but yeah, I mean, for some people, it's like it didn't take really much to push them off the edge, right? And
Yeah.
then COVID was kind of that singular event that was, um, you know, doing the final push, right? Um, and yeah, so death of despair. I mean, certainly made much worse by this pandemic, the past one. Um, yeah, I mean,
I don't want
yeah,
to link again, but go ahead. What about this economic problems, that are on the horizon again, and white collar suicides and the death of despair, may also impact those at the top, not necessarily just those at the bottom of the social ladder, and the risks and uncertainties. Honestly, this kind of reminds me of the Bauman thesis, the whole liquid fear and liquid modernity idea that we are in this stage of there is no stability, and it goes back to Durkheim too, anomic. It's chaos.
I,
Uh, and yeah, I don't know. Theoretically, we can branch it out in different areas. Now, these are sociologists we're talking about,
and
but
I haven't read the Zygmunt Bauman book, but I mean,
uh,
this metaphor, I mean,
yeah,
of like
liquid
physical states. I mean, it sort of reminds me of Marx's Communist Manifesto, right? When
yeah,
like the
also
famous line is, all that is solid melts into air.
thin
Um,
air.
and,
Yeah,
basically the idea is that, like, if you make something, so this goes back to Polanyi, so the argument about the fictitious commodity, right? That labor, land, money. I mean, these are fictitious commodity, and so if you try to, like, as in the capitalist system, if you try to make them into real commodities, right? If you transform them from the solid to the liquid, or the melted state,
you destroy
um,
humanity.
yeah, you destroy the substance of society, right? Um, and that's, and I mean, and so these are all truisms, right? The
Yeah.
Bauman, Marx, Polanyi, Durkheim, as you mentioned. I think they're all kind of saying the same thing, which is that, actually, when humanity is not ready, mentally, to live in a world where there are absolutely no certainties. I mean, just give you another example. So 2 days ago, I think, I saw this on, like, this tweet. It was about the capacities of GPT-4. Now, as you remember from the last podcast, we talked about GPT-3 and
Now
the
they have
implications on the education system, right? Now, it turns out that, um, so GPT-3 did well on some exam scores. I forgot exactly which ones. I mean, they let GPT take exams, like, you could have college entrance exams like SAT, you could have GRE, LSAT, and so forth, right? So take an AP exams, right? Um, and GPT-3 was good on some, but it was very poor on others. Now it's only 3 months later, right? That now that there is a trial on the GPT-4 already, right? And with the current trials of GPT-4, right? Uh, it does it performs very well. I mean, so upwards of the 95th percentile on a lot of these standardized exams.
Wow.
Uh, and now you could make the argument, well, it is almost like, when Watson, this like IBM machine, was able to win a game of Go, right? Which is like I guess a Chinese version of chess or something. Or when it was doing well at Jeopardy, right? That was like more than 10 years ago now, which was considered to be a big deal. But um, so I mean, so surely, I mean, the argument is not that GPT-4 right now is able to cover all of the white collar jobs, um, the skills of white collar labor. Um, but it is certainly moving in that direction. And it is, interestingly, it is moving at a pace um, that is extraordinarily fast, right? So, because I mean, if you remember, like the whole history of AI, I mean, there's this whole idea of the AI winter because they experimented with it in the 1970s, but the computing power back then was so low that they couldn't, scale it up. And then after about, I would say 2010, that's sort of like when the current AI generation was starting to have an impact because of the increase in the computing power. And now the computing power gets to such a level that they would be capable of, doing standardized exams. Um, and I mean, what are we going to be able to expect in the coming months, in the coming years,
Yeah.
regarding the capacities of these AI systems? Um, and yeah, and it's quite interesting because just from the debate that we used to have at the beginning with ChatGPT 3, 2 or 3 months ago, it was like, oh wow, it has all of these mistakes. Um,
Better.
yeah, but today, I mean, some of these mistakes. I mean, as I don't have an exhaustive list of
Yeah.
what those counter arguments were, but some of them have already been addressed, basically, in the newest generation of the ChatGPT 4. Um, yeah, and it's one of the interesting things. So obviously, like in social science, I mean, we're using R, which is the main software to do data analysis.
And SPSS?
SPSS is very rare nowadays. And I saw a tutorial on the Twitter where you can basically, so you upload the data set and then you can just do, commands. You can type the commands
Yeah.
and it will produce the results that you want. So you don't actually have to know how to code, like, 100 lines of code to produce the result that you want. Um, it will kind of almost like user interface, right? It will just put in what you want, what you need, like, please,
Oh,
calculate
wow.
the mean of those two variables or something like that, right? Um, right. And so assuming that we get to learn like how to use these tools, I guess the idea is that the data cleaning process would be substantially quickened.
Yeah.
And then what? And well, then you're able to produce more papers, right? I mean, but like, is the research experience going to be still as valuable as joyful, right?
Creating,
Um,
take the
yeah,
human element out of it, the laboring aspect of it. Yeah.
yeah, and then what you could imagine is going to happen, the CV inflation is going to get worse. So I mean, I think that
Yeah.
there's probably more and more publications that are added to your CV. And then also, we might get to the point where you automate the editorship and then the peer review process.
Yeah.
right? So you have basically three AI bots that will be your reviewers, right?
Maybe translations will be a lot easier. I know there's still a challenge sometimes for some of my German colleagues that their German is so written in such a way that you have to hire a translator over into English. And I can imagine this technology could perhaps get so perfect that you could translate it automatically, over from one language to another, you know. And I
Yeah,
noticed that transcription, I mean, transcription, these websites now that they offer it for free. And transcription used to be costly, even for transcribing interviews. There are still for-profit companies that do it, but now I can imagine transcribing could become easier. Port transcription, just putting it in a text format.
yeah. When I
And
took my first qualitative methods course undergrad, it was probably 2013. Um, and and the professor was instructing us like how do we do transcriptions on interviews, and she was basically like, yeah, you just type it into a Word document. So basically so right, the old days, what you would have to do, so you have the tape recorder, and then you play it for 5 or 6 seconds, and then you stop it, you pause it, and then you type it, right? And
yeah.
sometimes, like if you didn't like if you didn't get it clearly, then you have to rewind, and then you have to play that part again. Now this is kind of unimaginable because I mean, even like with Google Docs, there's a voice typing option.
Zoom has it too.
Yeah, I mean, closed captioning. Also, on YouTube. So if you load this particular video on YouTube, as long as it's a public video, it will do the auto transcript. Now it will not distinguish between the speakers, but maybe in the later iteration they might add that feature. But it's still workable transcript. It's pretty good actually. Then a service. So for book project, we were doing the transcriptions, and I was using um, the Office 365. That's a Microsoft Word, the online version where I think they allot you uh, like 3 4 hours, I think, of transcription length audio files uh, per month. So that's a nice service, and that one is pretty good. I mean, in terms of the quality, right? So you don't have to correct, like when you read the finished transcript, you don't have to correct it a
Edit.
lot. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
so that
Technology.
yeah, so technology is advancing fast, and it can have a very big impact. I mean, and it can be enormously disruptive. I mean, there's almost no journalist nowadays. I mean, unless you are like an established journalist who is not anxious about his job or her job, right? Um, I mean, essentially not knowing um,
Yeah.
whether you're going to be needed. Now, but then there's this argument. Well, what about the investigative reporters, right? So if you're doing investigative journalism, so your whole job is, with your phone recorder, you go to interview officials, and public people, company CEOs, and so forth, right? So you get all of the information, right? And then you have that messy process in your head to create a story, right? Um, yeah, well, that would certainly be valuable, I think, still. Um, but there's not a lot of investigative journalism that's happening anyway, right?
Yeah.
Um, I mean, there's a lot of like opinionating, right? There's a lot of like summaries of like press releases, usually from
Uh,
officials or company officials, right?
the question that I have, what will it do to the role of intellectuals in the 21st century? Intellectuals as paid intellectuals and with security. And I worry that, I mean, you have to kind of have a source of income. And um, to be an intellectual, you have to have freedom to think and write and not have to worry about costs of living. So with this technology, it could easily replace the role of intellectuals that are needed in society, to hold institutions accountable and to be the vanguard, I guess. But I don't know. Maybe there's some good that can come out of it. We don't know, right? We're more pessimistic, I guess, right, Larry? Are we pessimistic?
Yeah, so I mean,
Yeah,
so my, you could say true intellectual activity, which wasn't really the scholarly work that I'm evaluated on, but rather the the blogs, the podcasts, right? So these are non-subsidized activities. So I have to subsidize it based on other work that I'm doing, right? And yeah, I mean, and that's so, and that's really the real irony, right? Because with the blogging and the podcasting, I mean, I am able, as a nobody, right, basically as a non-established person, right, I can disseminate information freely into the internet, to the global world, to receive it. Um, but unless I already created some kind of reputation, think of Joe Rogan or somebody like that, right? Of big stature. Um, there's no you know income. There's no pecuniary value that's generated from these activities. Um, and this is the irony that we're living in, right? So on the one hand, everybody's given the bullhorn, right? So everybody gets to scream, everybody gets to speak.
speakerphone, speakerphone, yeah.
Yeah, everybody gets a speakerphone, but that's highly inflationary, right? Because if anybody can do that, then the only ones who will receive money from that are the people
Yeah.
that already have a high stature, basically, right? But they maybe gained the reputation in some other way, or um, yeah, or they were fortunate with the YouTube algorithms, right? So it's a mixture of creating a good product and then being upvoted somehow within the algorithms.
Mm.
Um, and that seems to be quite exceptional. I mean, there is this idea by Shervin Rosen, economist. It's called superstar economics. Um, and a simple example he has is like, okay, think of pop stars, right? Um, you could watch, okay, take some famous person that we know, like Taylor Swift or Lady Gaga, right? Um,
Prince
you know,
Harry,
Prince, yeah, the Prince Harry
he
interviews,
has his
right?
own, what is it, memoirs now, right?
Yeah, I read the memoir too, yeah. But I mean, so basically, you have these people that, like, yeah, they don't have to do much. I mean, they're already on the pedestal, and any content that they decide to upload on the platform will get hundreds of millions of views and clicks. Um, and now, so you see, the thing is that so in our attention economy, I mean, we still have 24 hours a day, right? So this is the budget is a time constraint, right? And we still have to work a certain amount of hours during the day. We still have to sleep a certain amount of hours, right? So basically, our entertainment budget is actually quite small. I mean, we're talking, even at best. I mean, if you have a leisure job, it's still only a few hours a day, right? Um, and then you're like, well, okay. I mean, even in my choice, I mean, my if I say, well, my entertainment budget is Lex Friedman and Joe Rogan, right? Or, like podcasters, right? Or, Marcus Lanz and Maybrit Illner. These are my two favorite ones. So but if I listen to these, let's say, four programs, right? Um, that's basically the extent of my entertainment budget, because there's not more hours a day that I have at my disposal to, receive entertainment. Um, so then you have an issue, right? Because the idea is like, okay, well, supporting small businesses, supporting small artists, and things like that. I mean, that all gets pushed out because no, because it's almost like saying, I don't want to use Bing, you know, I want to use Google because I know that, like there's hundreds of millions of billions of searches every day, right? And every search, will improve the algorithm slightly, right? So that, like, if you keep searching, then the Google engineers still built, even better algorithm to get you better results that you want, which a secondary search engine cannot give you, right? And by the same token, if I say I want to be entertained by the podcasters, by the TV shows, and so forth, I want to know for sure that it's going to be high quality. And so I'm not going to experiment with the, you know,
Yeah.
lower ranked in the algorithm, right? Um,
You think that there's a risk then that algorithms, because search engines also want to monetize search, that we're reduced with options, and particularly people, who don't always have access to certain institutions. And if you're lay public and you're just consuming what's readily available, then you're limited with options, and you're not getting you really are not part of the public sphere, and you're not part of public discussions. And I wonder if this often happens even nowadays with academic, what do you call it? There are these they're podcasts, but they're closed and they're hour long, and they have just, one or two presenters, and they have a slideshow, but they're not really opening up for interaction. You can send an emotion, you can do a clap even, and these are the things that we deal with in academia now. But I'm wondering if that kind of is not real communication, and it's actually not as interaction. And that increasingly happens with a lot of forums, including online forums. They are not the real thing, and they uh, don't allow people really maybe sometimes to communicate, and there's this barrier. So that's my thesis. I think that maybe sometimes, these technologies, including search engines, they may even assist you with finding a topic, and then because the way things are set up, you're kind of steered in certain directions where you used to have autonomy, and you might just go in a bookstore and you randomly pick up a book like I did, just uh, without some suggestion from an algorithm program giving you an Amazon link. You know? So I often, like, because I do, let's say, sociology topics, and I search them, and I get all these thousands of textbook suggestions on, obviously, sociology, but maybe I don't want that. Right?
right.
So
So, well, there's different aspects here. So, the last point you made is about serendipity, right? So the value of randomly finding things, which I think that's why I think going to physical bookstores, physical libraries, I think is still a valuable endeavor. Because you want to uncover things that an algorithm might not get you, because an algorithm will only feed you the things you already like. Um, and it's a possible way of living, but then, you know, there's not as much excitement. I think the excitement to life comes from
Yeah.
trying out new things, which I guess goes 180
Yeah.
degrees to what I just said 5 minutes ago, right? With the Google and Joe Rogan or whatever, right? Um, yeah, but then so the other argument that you make is about the lack of democratization,
Yeah.
and I would say that so it really depends on what the
Habermas
format.
direction, I guess. Yes. I
Yeah,
guess
I
I'm.
mean, it depends on what format you are seeking out, right? So, yeah, if you have a format like our podcast, like I would not want to live stream it on YouTube, even though we technically could, right?
Right. Right.
And I don't want to, live, read out the comments that people write to us. Um, because it's a different kind of experience, right? Then it's because I think part of the allure of the podcast is to hear like two people have a conversation, right? And then the focal point is the exchange of ideas, right? The conversation itself. Um, and then you don't necessarily get that with a sort of ask me anything kind of format, audience engagement. There's certainly some areas where I think user engagement is happening, and the main example is, of course, Twitter, right?
Of course. Yeah.
That's a space where everybody's given a microphone, uh,
Yeah.
and which can to some extent be problematic, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because I mean, the whole point of like cancel culture,
Right.
right, which was
Yeah.
arising, right, because the idea is like if I have a particular political viewpoint, it gets censored, I get canceled by the mob. Um, the question is, well, where does the mob come from? I mean, it's basically it's Twitter, right? It's the social media, right?
Yeah.
So
I'm sure you're probably familiar with Pierre Perdue, and I always go back to one of his really short publications. He wrote 1998. This one was called On Television, and it was actually like 70 pages long, and he really criticizes uh, television and journalists, but he does it in a way that really asks the question of like moderation and selection of topics, and sometimes TV shows. And he's dead. Purdue died, I think, was it 2003 or something, 2002.
2002,
But
yeah.
yeah, it was a legacy in French sociology. But the reason why I go back to this book, and he really tries to connect that a lot of even television stations are corporate entities, and there's a lot of money interest, and that's why you have the popularity sometimes of weather forecasting and not political debates. Because I think in the book he was talking about weather forecasting is not political, and so television stations nowadays, and you see this in the U.S. frequently, and even traffic reporting is far more apolitical. So you have this bombarded constantly, and it's just not, I guess for audience ratings, political topics can easily be consequential, for television stations. So anyways, I highly encourage that book. There's so many different aspects he goes into. This is like in the late 90s. You could very well make the same point about social media companies, Twitter, and their monetary interests, and they have to sell to their advertisers, but also this moderation question, of certain topics, and um, limitation of time for certain topics. Look, the good thing about us, I mean, we could technically be on here for 5 6 hours if we could endure it, right? Without passing out. But like, can you imagine if you look at sometimes some news broadcasts in the United States, they get shortened and shortened. They're shorter. There's a lot of commercialization. Even 60 Minutes, when I watch it, or Meet the Press. There's just bombardment of commercialization to where the actual debate gets shortened and shortened and shortened and shortened. And I wonder what impact that has over time. They just don't have time to talk about it. And then there's the next commercial, and after I don't know if you ever come across that. But in a podcast like this, obviously we don't have commercial interest, so we can go on forever, right? But if you are a show, NBC or ABC or even CNN, you're constantly having to break uh, for a commercial break. You know, I think I'm not sure if they did that with presidential debates. Do you remember? Were there like commercial breaks?
Oh yes, they have that as well. Yeah,
Yeah.
not as often. Well, it's still 15-minute debate sections maybe, and then to go
Right.
for a commercial break. Yeah, so
I
there
don't know,
was this.
but I really thought Purdue really nailed it. I mean, even back then, he was ahead of the crowd. I think he understood, uh, that there's moderation, there's monetary interest, and even a place like Twitter. Twitter is now kind of a Elon Musk kind of, a business. So there's always this monetary pressure and advertisers and uh, monetizing, and so I don't know. Maybe that could be a negative.
Well, there's this interesting anecdote by Noam Chomsky regarding concision in uh, the news media. So, he was once asked, why does Chomsky not get invited to mainstream uh, television news? So we're talking CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, etc. And so the short answer, of course, is the ideology, right? Where he is very much anti-military industrial complex, anti-U.S. foreign policy, which most of the news media that gets money from the military industrial complex, they are obviously don't take that viewpoint. Um, but but it's interesting is it's not just about ideological opposition, right? It's also about what Chomsky calls his lack of concision, right? So because if you think of whenever a journalist asks him a question, and it's mostly independent media, independent journalists, like Democracy Now or something like that, right?
Yeah.
That would interview Chomsky. And he would give these really long answers, right? Like they're like 10, 15-minute long answers.
They
Kind
cut
of
it,
like
I
an,
guess. But they let him talk. Let him talk. Yeah.
yeah, it's like it's a little
Okay.
bit like yeah, he's a professor, right? He's an
Yeah,
intellectual. So and also because like his argument is that he has to take his time to explain things because his points are controversial within the US discourse, right? If he says that the United States is a terrorist state, I mean, I think that's how far Chomsky would go. He would have to justify, I mean, he would have to give examples about interventions in Grenada, in Haiti, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and so on and so forth, right? He would
really.
have to
Yeah.
he'd have to give a whole list of things about what went wrong in U.S. foreign policy in order to make his case. Now, but the important idea is that he cannot squeeze his long-winded explanation about U.S. foreign policy in a 7-minute segment. Because also, if you think about it, in a 7-minute segment where the news presenter, wants to ask at least 3 questions. So you figure that, okay, if 1 minute is questioning, so it means you have 2 minutes per answer. Right. So basically everything that you say, I mean, you have to either be an extraordinarily quick speaker, which is, nobody can do that really, or nobody can do that and be understood. Um, you know, and therefore somebody like Chomsky couldn't show up. However, if you took the mainstream opinion, like let's say if you said, like if you go back 20 years ago when the Iraq War started, right? And if I had said on the news television show that Saddam Hussein is a terrorist who owns weapons of mass destruction, uh, we should go in and kick his ass, right? Like if I had said it like this, right, which is very concise statement, right? It only took me two or three short sentences to make my case. Then it would have been very uncontroversial, right?
Hmm.
While the sort of the Chomsky position, which I think, I mean, like obviously, like if you showed up in Russian or Chinese television, it would probably be less controversial, like the things that he's saying. But on U.S. television, critiquing U.S. foreign policy, yeah, I think he would get significant amounts of pushback, and he would need to have the time to make his case.
Yeah.
Um,
So
yeah, so
it's a kind of curtailment of speech acts, I guess, and the time used as a way to control the way I guess people are able to debate or not debate. And I guess that goes back to Purdue. I mean, like Purdue was talking about weather. Why is that so, like, again, why is that so attractive in news broadcasts? Because weather is harmless, and you just keep talking about the weather. And I really started watching some local channels, and it is true. I mean, like 45% of it or 50% of it is the weather. you know, so and weather, I don't know, and if you watch in your local news where you live, like it starts to raise a question mark. They have professional meteorologists, and they spend all this time. Where is the rain going to come? What's the humidity like? And if we just did that with social issues in the U.S., we took more time to explain and have some experts on shows every now and then, like you and I, right?
yeah, and even if you stick with the meteorologists, I
Yeah.
mean, they in America they're like real fear mongers, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, oftentimes like because so I don't watch a lot of TV, but sometimes like if there's like a big storm coming up, I would usually look up like the 3 minute segment where they explain the weather forecast. Uh, and but it's like they make it seem like you know that there's something very dangerous that's coming down the pike. That oh my God, there's a big storm, like you know,
Yeah.
you should get prepared. You should put stuff like loose things. You should take them indoors.
Yeah, it's really
Uh,
instructional. Yeah, very detailed.
yeah, you shouldn't be going out at all. Um, and then when I wait for the weather to arrive, and it's never as bad, right? Um, okay, so
No.
there are a few moments where, okay, like sometimes, yeah, okay, you have a monsoon style rain, like really heavy rain, downpour. It's okay, that's terrible, but that doesn't happen that often. So, and then this morning you were like, looked at the weather channel stuff. I mean, it's like, oh, there's going to be a strong wind that's blowing. And then I go out and I was expecting the heavy wind, and it was like, I mean, there's wind for sure, but it's not a tornado. It's not going to blow you away, right?
Yeah.
Um,
But I'm sure you watch, Austrian news or German news. They do have presenters, but a lot of times it's just like 1 minute. It's real quick, and it's just temperatures that are presented. That's it. So I don't know how that is in different parts of the world. If it's just an American thing, whether it's such a big topic, which I understand the seriousness of it, but it does occupy a whole lot of time, on television. So
yeah,
from
but
what I
it goes back to the point that you mentioned, which is that it's uncontroversial,
yeah,
right? That but especially like in local TV news, right? I mean, you don't want to be perceived as being partisan,
yeah,
right? So you just
talk about the weather.
well, there's a few buckets, right? So the first bucket is crime. So usually, like if there's like a, I mean, especially in Philadelphia news, I mean, there's like a shooting every day. I
Daily.
mean, probably like two or three shootings a day or something, right?
Yeah. Same,
So then, yeah, so they
same.
report about that extensively. Yeah, then they show the weather segment, and there's at least three or four per like news show, right? Um, and then the third segment would be it's kind of like human interest stories, right?
Cooking or
So
something. Pet donations.
yeah, donations for a local school, or for some, I don't know, sports club. Yeah, sports is its own segment. Um, and then yeah, that's what local news is, right? So and but for me, it's kind of weird because like if I wasn't watching any local news, you know, I wouldn't say that I would be much worse informed about the world, right? But for instance, like the stuff that I was preparing for the blog on homelessness, I mean, like the stuff which takes some research, right? So
Yeah.
reading government reports, reading the Wikipedia article, reading some newspaper articles related to that, right? So, right, it takes a little bit of background research. I think, I
Yeah,
mean, that feels to me like, okay, this is an important story, right? Um, uh,
definitely.
and then with local news, I'm sort of like, okay, well, if I didn't know about it, it might be okay with that. I mean, sure, certainly, I mean, like the, I mean, or like the last couple of blogs, where I focused mostly on geopolitics because this is the exigency of the moment, right? This is like, after we came out of the pandemic, it's like, we're scraping by on, the edge of nuclear destruction, basically, right?
Things go so rapidly, in the news, Ukraine, and then there's this bank that went down, and then it's just so rapidly, things are, I'm amazed how you keep up with it. Just, because it goes so fast, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the bank issue. I mean, so I did this. I just so I yesterday I looked up Google Trends, because at Google Trends you can look at specific search terms frequency, and the first mention of SVB, the Silicon Valley Bank, was happening on March 9, I think. So before that, it was like close to zero, right? March 9, and then 10, 11, it was sort of exploding. And then now, 12, it came down again. So the last couple of days, it came down a little bit. So, um,
Yeah.
and but then what's interesting, so I mean, so Credit Suisse, which is one of the big Swiss
Yeah.
banks, we saw the headline today about them being in potential financial trouble. There's a second bank whose name I forgot in America,
The
uh,
Republic, I think. Republic Bank.
Republic Bank. Now, are these all Silicon Valley related banks? So they're not the Wall Street ones, right? Uh,
Uh, you put me on the spot.
yeah,
I don't know.
yeah, we'd be
Uh,
paying a lot more attention, I think, um, if it was a Wall Street bank, because I guess this, in terms of
yeah,
the capitalization, right, the amount of money that's in the Wall Street banks is just staggering. So,
yeah.
yeah, if any of these big banks were like really struggling, like we're talking like JP Morgan, or like the Wells Fargo or Goldman Sachs, if any of these big banks are struggling, then,
That's a
well,
concern.
then finance is going to be very shaky. Now the problem is that, so what I'm not sure about is, to what extent is SVB connected, with the other banks in the
Wells
economy.
Fargo and Chase Manhattan. Yeah.
Yeah, with the mainstream banks,
Well,
right?
they're so embedded together that as soon as one takes a hit, all the other ones take a hit, and that's what my impression is. That when I was reading, there's a lot of fear, and smaller like banks, the customers are moving their money to the big banks because they think, well, those banks are too big to fail, and there's if we move it really quickly, maybe we'll be safe because government may, insure at least, a big bank like Wells Fargo or Chase Manhattan, it's too big to fail, and we couldn't possibly allow that bank to fail. So that's the thinking, at least. I think even Bank of America had like, I want to say 25 billion moved in the last day or two of just people moving their money to Bank of America or other bigger banks. So there's definitely some psychology. There's some psychological behavior.
Yeah.
Trying to remember toilet, what do you call it, the toilet paper phenomenon, and but there's a real material consequence, but then there's also psychological behavior, and this is, investors, and then there's, short sellers, and then there's the fact that a lot of these banks, they're also, they have stocks, and then their stocks reflect, the view of how much the bank is still worth. And then the rating agencies, right? Was it Moody? The rating agencies can literally, I mean, they put a grade on a bank, and if it's bad, then the bank is pretty much done with, right?
Yeah, these rating agencies, I mean, they don't work properly, right? Because SVB had the highest rating, right? Couple of
Yeah,
days before the crash, right?
totally contradictory. Yeah.
Yeah, so the banks are definitely connected to some extent. I think the government did the right thing here in this one. I mean, um, so in every bank you have like two factions, right? So you have the shareholders, right? The ones that hold shares of that bank. I mean, expecting assets
Dividend.
to go up, and then of course the valuation of the bank goes up too. And then you have the deposits, right? Which are the customers, right? The customers' money.
The
Um,
little people, right? Not the investors.
well, so with
Not
the SVB, actually, it's like entrepreneurs. So these are people who, like upper middle class to rich, basically, right? So I think SVB was a common man bank. This sort of like,
okay. And FDIC will protect 250,000, right?
yeah,
For every
officially. But now I think the government came out and said that they will insure all of the assets of SVB. So all of the depositor assets, right? So the shareholders, they will have to take the loss. I mean, as soon as the
stock goes way down.
well, we don't know right now with the bankruptcy chapter that's being opened. So if it gets acquired by another bank, then everything will go on as before. I mean, of course, that bank which acquires will have some additional liabilities on the balance sheet. There'll probably be some extra Fed money that will probably grease that deal, um, to basically allow the bank to recapitalize. Um, but it's important. So the shareholders are going to have to lose out, basically. Um, they're going to have to take the cuts. They're going to have to take the hit. Um, but I think the depositors, right? They should be the assets should be kept safe because as soon as the because if you screw with the depositors, right? So a shareholder, it's like you're taking the risk, right? The risk of
Purchasing stock.
of
Yeah.
purchasing the stock, right? I mean, of course, there's a reward for purchasing the stock potentially if the value goes up, but you're taking the risk. Now, if you're a depositor, however, it's not about risk taking for you. I mean, you just want somebody to hold your money, right? And then to then turn around, the bank says, sorry, we're closing the bank and you can't have your money back. I mean, I think that's because if that happens even once, right? Um,
Distress. Yeah.
yeah, you're gonna have the ripple effect. I mean, like if people are starting to stampede, and so this is what happened in 2010 or and actually 2015, right? I mean, the Greek financial crisis, right? When basically there was a standoff between the Greek government, which didn't want to sign a new bailout agreement, and then the troika, the ECB, that wanted them to sign it. and um, and the Greeks panicked, right? Because as soon as you put the possibility of a default, you're going to have people pulling the cash out of the Greek banks and trying to deposit it in a German bank or something like that, right? Which of course they could do, right? Because they're EU citizens, right? They're part of the same union. Um, but of course, if you're a Greek bank, the Greek banking system, and if you're the Greek government, of course you don't want that to happen, right? Because the more people are drawing the cash out, the worse the banking crisis will become, right? Because you have
Oh,
fractional reserve banking. I mean, it's not like you have all of the assets of the depositors. I think you have like 10% of the assets in reserve, right? And then the rest is, fractional reserve banking, right? So you lend it out, right? Um,
hmm.
so you can never have a system where the vast majority of the depositors want the money back, because then the financial system will just crash. Um, so that's why the
The
government did the right
safeguards,
thing.
like some safeguards they put in place, yeah, to precisely prevent run of the bank, right?
Yeah, that's right. So you want to keep an even keel. Now the worry is that, okay, you got these two banks that are struggling, plus the Credit Suisse, so it's maybe a third bank globally. How much of a contagion effect are we seeing, right? I mean, if there's a contagion effect resulting in financial panic, um, and then what could the Fed do in this case, right? They have, okay, 4% interest rates, so we'll drop it down to zero again, maybe. And then we're gonna do another round of cheap money. I mean, the Fed balance sheet is already much higher than it was in 2008. So yeah, so basically everybody has to hope that it doesn't go as bad as
Yeah.
you
Or
know.
some of the bigger banks swallow up the smaller banks and like mergers, or in some cases, some nationalization of some or some takeover of banks.
Yeah, so
If
in
it's really,
2008, right, you had the TARP program, right,
yeah,
which was, it was not really
trillion,
nationalization.
right?
It was
Trillion, trillion, 2 trillion or a trillion? A lot.
$1 trillion or so, but it was basically the idea was that, so you would use the tax money, and then with the tax money you recapitalize the banks, right? So basically, you restore some of the assets that they have, and that way the depositor money is safe. And then as the economy is recovering, then what the banks did was they hiked the fees on some of the depositor products, and then based on those fees, they repaid the government on TARP. So actually, the government probably did make some profit based off of the TARP program. Um, but yeah, it's one of those solutions that the government came up with. It was a great uh, book by Adam Tooze. He's an economic historian.
Colombia, right?
Yeah, Columbia. I think the book was titled "Crashed." I think 2018. But yeah, but it's a thick book, but it's a very good summary. I mean, it's a really good summary of the events, because I mean, if you look at the references that he has at the back of the book, I mean, it's mostly like Financial Times.
Hmm.
So he's basically like, because one of the newspapers that follow like financial economic news very closely, and um and Adam Tooze is one of those people that did a very good job documenting uh basically the cascade of events, right?
Yeah.
Like, Lehman
He's
Brothers
like
and
an
so forth.
economic historian, you would call him economic historian.
Yeah, he's an economic historian. Yeah, that's probably the best way to put it.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, but it's a good summary of basically what happened and then the sequence of events. Um, and is there a risk that we might be going back there again?
Hmm.
It's still too early to tell. I mean, I think that's. I mean,
Yeah.
as long as we don't hear like more banking collapses, I mean, if it's just one or two, we might be fine with that. But we don't know.
What
I mean,
like
what?
hypothetical, intentional, like let's try to crash our banks. So, this idea that creative destruction of that, then you can write off all the lost money and then you just acquire more. That's just throwing something out there. It's just that sometimes crashes are good, like it because it burns or it actually eliminates some money. Consequently, it affects people that have accounts or investors. But I mean, I was thinking that maybe sometimes the
Yeah,
idea is,
if you're a debtor,
uh,
you're probably quite happy
yeah,
that maybe some of the loans are going to be written down, right?
yeah. So it's like you don't know exactly how much loss they already had, and then if there's this, uh, vagueness. I mean, if I guess they're going to look at the numbers, and where all the money went, and if any of it went back into bonuses or it's I would actually look at CEOs, and if there was any insider information, and I think the sale of the shares of the guy, the CEO, I think that happened like right at the moment. Of course, I mean, if you own shares in your own company, I guess you wouldn't want it to fail. But I really wonder if that's ethical. Like if you were you're running a company, you're a bank, you're CEO of the bank, and you got shares in the bank, right? Maybe that has to be separated. I don't know. The same thing with Tesla. I mean, the same thing with Elon Musk. I mean, doesn't he have Tesla shares, right?
So you're talking about, ownership versus management.
Yeah, it's kind of converged together, like in a bank, it's even more risky because the people that are managing it are also owners of it, so uh their own interests are involved, obviously, not just getting a salary or executive compensation, but they also have shares in it. In a bank, it's really peculiar. My view, I guess I'm more skeptical. Maybe that has to be, looked at, especially if it's uh, a significant amount of shares, and if they're sold, and if a person has inside information, prior to the bank going down, and everybody else, they lose all their money and value in shares, but people that have inside information don't, right? That's why the CEC, I think, is all over it now. I think that's why there's an investigation, because if you have information that you could use an advantage, then you could sell it before everybody else can.
I think insider trading is covered under the financial law, right? So
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
it, it is illegal. I
There will
think it
be an
should be illegal.
investigate. There'll be an investigation. Again, I'm not a legal expert, but in most cases, there's always a legal investigation of the sale of the shares, especially if there's a significant amount of shares that are sold, right when it goes under, you know. So I don't know. We'll find all that out. I'm sure New York Times and all the great investigative journalists we have in this country will all go into that, right?
Yeah, unless the
The
papers
five that we
themselves are
have left,
being
the five that we have left,
unless those papers themselves are being bought by these big financial companies, right?
the banks
Um,
only.
yeah, so I would just want to throw in the reference to David Graeber's book on debt,
Oh yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
first 5,000 years.
And he's dead though.
Because
Right? He died.
yeah, he died 3 years ago. But I think that the sentiment that you were expressing earlier about the benefits of like wiping the slate clean
Mhm.
is very clearly demonstrated in the historical examples that Graeber was using in his book.
Hmm.
Um, so I think it's the ancient Sumerians that were developing finance and credit. That's sort of one of the um, signs of civilization. It's about language. It's about bureaucracy, centralized government, military, so there's a bunch of things, but one of the things that they developed was, of course, the coins, like the currency, but then also like accounting, like record keeping of, and then the next step beyond like inventing coins and accounting is debt, right? Because now you can keep track of like how much money was lent by person A to give to person B, right?
So real
Now,
like accounting science that was already developed in this ancient society. Wow.
yeah, and well, I mean, I don't think it was like at the level of like double entry bookkeeping, like the
Yeah,
ones that
yeah,
was
yeah.
developed in Italy, which I think 13th century, 14th century or so. But anyway, the by having accounting, so then and currency, you can have debt, right? That's the next thing. And the problem is that if you have too much debt, right, this is always an issue, right? Because if you have too much debt, um, then you know, then like you get to the point where you enslave the debtor, right? So you already is the creditor's property, right? You probably even enslave his children, his wife, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it still gets to the point where like this person, even if you're like a slave, for many lifetimes, for many generations, wouldn't be able to pay off the debt because the interest rate is just much higher than any income that the slave would be able to generate. Okay, so so then basically what you have is this idea of debt jubilee. So you would forgive the debt, I think after 7 years or so, right? So you wouldn't get to this exploitative social relationship like slavery, for instance.
Yeah, unfree relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, um, and and Graeber, of course, made a normative point, right? So he wasn't just describing it; he made a normative point, which is that we should be doing that too. I mean, so you have in the U.S. we see the government taking steps toward eliminating student debt, and it's quite interesting that if you follow the debate, I mean, it's sort of um, it the student loan debate took a lot of turns, right? Um, because so under the Obama administration, what they did was they stopped um like using the contractors, like usually like Sally Mae, where it is usually private student loan, companies.
For
Uh,
profit.
yeah, the for-profit ones. So basically, you cut those out. So if you have the federal student loans programs, that would now be directly handled by the government. So the government, for the taxpayers, would still be making a profit off of the student loans that uh, the student loan students debtors are repaying. Um, but you would cut out the middleman. So there was a little bit of an advance, right? Because then you can cap, because the government would then cap the interest rate at a lower rate than for the private company. So okay, that sounds good. Uh, Under Trump, nothing happened good for the students because the education secretary Betsy DeVos, you know, was clearly pro corporate, right? Um, and now with Biden, I mean, it's interesting because now he's saying that okay, we're going to forgive $10,000 student debt, and now they're saying 20,000, right? Um, I think there's some details that would probably still have to be worked out, but it seems to me that you hear already anecdotally of some cases of students where basically the most of the debt that they had in college has been wiped out. Um, and then of course, and also under Obama, there was like this 10 year repayment program, I think, but it was a very specific program. I think you had to be like a civil servant or something like that, right? You had to work for some public
Yeah.
job, right? But yeah, I mean, but those are the things. I mean, you see increasingly more of that. Uh, and I'm not sure where the total loan burden is in the economy now. Last time I checked, it was like $1.6 trillion, which is a lot of money. Um, but it's kind of like I don't know. So I'm influenced by my former advisor Randy Collins about a credential inflation.
Yeah.
And basically the idea that like he also calls the education, specifically the higher education system, as like the hidden welfare state, right? Um, and it's a very much hidden as long as it's like student debt financed, right?
Mm.
So the students have to take out loans in order to attend university. But if you make it to such an extent that, so let's say you reform the student loan system, so you still give out student loans, but then eventually you create the conditions to forgive the debt, right? A significant chunk of it after, let's say, repayment of 10 years or something like that, right? So you're only paying effectively a fraction, right, of the original value of the loan, right?
Mm.
Um, and so then, well, I mean, of course, the loss on the balance sheet would be by the taxpayers of the United States, which doesn't sound too bad for me, right? Because you know, because we're a rich country, we should be able to afford that.
Yeah.
Um, and also more highly educated people, they also work higher wage jobs, right? So that of course means that they pay more taxes to the system, right? So the money is coming back, right? But it's just the
So
problem is like
a hidden
if
welfare state idea, yeah. Makes sense. Indirectly, the state subsidizes and then it creates benefits again for the economy, right?
yeah, I mean,
Indirectly.
so if you forgive the
Like
student
a new
debt,
deal.
I mean, um, because right now there's a lot of anxiety, right? And there's a lot of like young people that are delaying marriage and childbirth and home purchases, right? Those are the three accomplishments of being an adult, I guess. Um, and those life decisions are now being delayed because of the student debt.
Yeah.
And then if you wipe the slate clean, I mean, it's basically one burden less, right? That people have to worry about. And but then there could be a counter argument. It's like, well, what about European countries? With very low student debts, and they still have very low fertility rates and low home purchases. Um,
Help me out with Austrian universities, and I guess German universities is still very similar. Of course, they also have private universities with enormous amount of tuition charge, but I think most of them probably go to public universities, which are state subsidized. So the fees that they pay are just the fees, and there really isn't any loan taking. Unless they want to take loans, just they can't take loans out in Austria. You can take out a loan as a student in Austria under there are subsidized loans, but not as heavily and it's not as big as you would think in the US, where there's like 30,000, $40,000, 50,000 or more. I'm just thinking that maybe it's proportion from a proportion standpoint, the amount that European students tend to owe is less because it is often subsidized and it is there. Yeah. So am I right with that? Yeah.
well, I don't know anybody in Austria who has taken out student loans. There is a system where, so first of all, it is tuition free as long as you study within the allotted time. So if you have, like, let's say, a bachelor's degree that takes 3 years, you have two tolerance semesters, so you basically have 4 years to finish a 3-year program, right?
And if you go over, then you get charged.
Then you get
Okay.
charged.
That,
Yes.
that they have that in Germany. Well, they used to have.
Um,
Yeah, they have.
yeah. So that's part one of the system. So that saves you uh, the the need to take out a loan. And then part two of the system is like a student subsidy, right? So which is not a lot of money. I don't think it's like maybe 200 euros or something. I mean, it's not that much money, um, but if you, I mean, let's say if you're from Vienna, right? So um, you could stay in your parents' house. So you could decide not to move out. You attend the University of Vienna, so you commute there, right? And yeah, you wouldn't really have to take out loans in those cases, right?
Yeah.
And that's quite common. I mean, I know that in Sweden, there is a very high student loan burden, not from the tuition, which is free. So
The
the same as in
housing,
Austria. Yeah,
housing
it's
and
about the
living.
housing. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
about the room and board because if you look at the European-wide statistics about um, the percent of population in single-person households, so we're talking about people who live in, either their own house or usually in their own apartment, right? Um, it's very high in the Scandinavian countries like Denmark and Sweden. More single-person households, very common. Like usually small apartments, like yeah, one bedrooms, right?
Flats.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
the Swedes, they have a very you know strong idea of yeah individualism, I guess, right? Like independence,
Yeah.
specifically from your own parents. Like as soon as you grow up as an adult, so a rite of passage, like when you graduate high school, would be starting college in a town that is different from where your parents live. So let's say, I mean, if your parents are from Gothenburg, but then you want to study in Stockholm or something, right? Um, and I have relatives in Umeå, which is like 7 hours train
Way
ride
up top. Very, very high.
north
That's
of
way up.
yeah, north of Stockholm. Yeah.
I don't know. I heard
But
of.
they also like a university town, right? It's like
Yeah.
100,000 population, but they are a university town. Um, but yeah, I mean, but still, I mean, students, they want to live in the cities different than the parents. Which I mean, in Central, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, I mean, they don't really have that sort of idea. I mean, I think the further south and east you go, I think the more I think people think in terms of like family units. Like in Italy, I mean, like the percent of like 20 and 30 somethings that are living with their parents is very high, actually.
Yeah.
Which might also explain why they have very low fertility rate, right?
Yeah.
The people don't want to have because people who also live with their parents, like adults who are living with their parents, they tend to also work low wage jobs, right? And then of course, I mean, and of course, low wage jobs. I mean, yeah, I mean, it is correlated with probably less likelihood to get married and have kids and stuff like that. Um, yeah,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
anyway, so in terms of the Austrian education system, I think that um, yeah, it's very rare to take out loans for studies. Uh, and it gets to the point where it's like, I mean, the student loans were so low. I mean, my brother, I mean, he was studying for many years and he never completed his program. Um, but there wasn't that much disincentive because I mean, even if you work a part-time job, if you paid, let's say, 700 euros in annual tuition. So if you think about like a monthly salary for a part-time job is about this much money, right? So, 1 month of work and you can cover 12 months of tuition, right? Even on a part-time job, right? So there's not really that much of a barrier to study, right? If you wanted to study. Um, and yeah, that's maybe the legacy of probably the social democratic state. Um, they still have. Yeah, but overall, I mean, I agree with the Randy Collins assessment. I think that the education, especially higher education, I think it's it should be treated as a hidden welfare state, and I think and we need more and more of that, because of the advances in GPT-3, GPT-4, um, I mean, these things are going to get better, and then it's like, well, okay, like let's say hypothetically, I mean, let's say we get rid of half of all the white collar jobs that we presently have, right? Maybe not in one stroke, but over time, it's going to diffuse. Um,
Those
but
people need new training or new sectors to go into, I guess.
yeah, but I don't know, like, why not have like a PhD in pottery art,
Oh, wow. That'd be awesome.
uh, right, where it's like, oh, you learn all about like how do you sculpt, like that thing, and make it like a real science, um,
Something that I remember, I mean, when I was studying at German university, I was amazed with the size of faculties and uh, foreign language and history, and you're at Princeton, so I'm thinking that it's not just a department of history, it could be professors that are hired just to focus on medieval history or modern day history, on economic history, political history, and yeah, you could always widen the departments, and yeah, that's always that's one way to do it is you just create more employment in the public sector. You widen the public sector, and that would be the idea. I still remember one of the departments of sociology, I think Uppsala in Sweden, they had like 60 PhD candidates or something, or graduate. I mean, it's 60, And if you think about most programs in the US, I mean, even if it's a large department, maybe like UC Berkeley or something, I mean, they might have 25 cohort, or 20, but not like 60. So I don't know, it's just quite interesting. The size of programs, how many people they support as far as teaching assistantships or uh, you know, different departments, how big they are, how well
there's 60
financed.
PhD students, and then like how many
I think it was master's and
undergraduates?
PhD. Yeah, I think it's a total of 60. And I was like just counting. I was just counting. I was like, wow, there's a lot of people employed in Uppsala, and now that obviously you could just go off of the telephone, directory when you could see all of the the numbers of people, but it's
Yeah, but you
massive.
also have to consider Uppsala, so there would be for, I mean, it would be a big department
Yeah.
for the country, right?
Yeah,
So
Uppsala
because
is
there's not a
probably
whole
the
lot of universities with those
second or third
departments.
biggest Swedish public university. So, but this is a small country, and it's just amazing how much they invest in social science. I think at all sorts of. I mean, they have a lot of foundations, and they have all this uh, external money, public money. Same thing we have, but uh, maybe not so much actually. So maybe there isn't as much public funding as we think. Uh, uh, and so much of it is based on tuition fees, enrollment. So enrollment often dictates, the money in for faculty positions, for instance. So I don't know, but it's a big topic. I'm not an expert in it, but I just compare and contrast. Like if you think about there could be jobs that are sometimes just created. Now, of course, David Graeber, what would he would say? Those might be bullshit jobs, You don't want that. But maybe some jobs that have some value, or um
Well,
not
we have to go back to the original definition, right? So a bullshit job would be ones where the worker himself thinks that it's bullshit, right? That it's useless.
right.
And now you could say from a societal standpoint, like if you are getting, let's say, a PhD in the art of pottery, you might consider it to be bullshit. Um, However, for the people who are number one doing it, right, they obviously don't think it's bullshit because why would they select to study it in the first place? And then secondly, the people who are holding the finished product in their hands, maybe the consumers or just art collectors or something like that. For them, it's also not bullshit because they are clearly appreciating that form of art, right?
Yeah.
So, and as long as the person himself that's creating that piece of art thinks it's valuable, I think it is valuable. Um, and it's a recognition of the fact that you know we are a wealthy society
Yeah.
that doesn't need a lot of labor, right? That doesn't need a lot of actually useful, impactful labor contribution, right? Um, and in recognition of such, I think that yeah, again, my main idea I think is that we want to create a leisure society that uh, where everybody can develop based on their talents and interests, regardless of the market value, right?
Totally
Um,
with you. Yeah, totally with you. Sinngesellschaft, right? Sin.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a society
Uh,
based on um, yeah, the values, the tastes, the interests of the members in that community. I mean, um, yeah, that's why I mean it's interesting because the historically, I mean, as soon as you have hierarchy in society, which usually comes from agriculture, right? Because you always have most people were peasants, so that's the exploited class, and then you have the small, you can call them aristocratic class. The aristocratic class, they were legally the landowners, right? They were holding the rights over the land, and then those landlords, those aristocrats, they either create their own protection force, right? They would employ their own mercenaries, or oftentimes what would happen is they would be showing fealty to some king, and so the king would be holding the empire, right? And then his economic base is basically whatever the feudal lords were paying him in fees, right? Um, and yeah, so but basically, I mean, historically, the idea of having the aristocratic class was to create, you could say, leisure, you know, um, a group of leisure, men of leisure, so to speak. Um,
mhm.
not everyone, but most of them were. I mean, there were some that were like, you know, into nitty gritty, like agricultural management, like, um, but mostly, I think, well, there's two parts to that, right? So on the one hand, it's like the leisure society, the way how I understand it, which is, I don't know,
Exempted from that, right?
yeah,
They
so it
don't
would be like things like horse riding. It would be,
like Veblen's idea of leisure class, I guess.
yeah, it would
But
be,
you talk about ancient societies or agricultural societies. Okay,
that's
top
right, yeah, yeah.
top crust. Okay,
Um, and
see
then
that.
another set of activities would be politics, right? So if you go back to Aristotle's Politics, where he describes the definition of uh, oligarchic system, oligarchic society, is to have um, the aristocrats, which are the landowners. Actually aristocrat comes from aristoi, which means um, I think it means the landowner or something. Um, but yeah, so the aristocrats, they would appoint the officials who would run the government. Um, because only they had sort of the leisure time to you know study the soil quality of a particular region, right? And basically, to decide whether to settle there, things like that, right? Um, and of course, if you're a peasant, like if you're working with your hands, you wouldn't have the leisure to study
No.
these subjects, right? Technical subjects. Um,
If I'm not mistaken, I think Hannah Arendt in her book The Human Condition makes this distinction between labor and work. And laboring, in her definition, is this animal state, almost like, of just, you know, an animal kind of condition that people are in a slave condition, and they're just laboring, and there's no, skill set or whatever. It's just doing it. And then she uses that distinction of work, of thinking, and it becomes a craft, like a craft idea. So I can see it with the evolution of different societies, how the notion and definition of work change, especially from agricultural society to pre-industrial, industrial, post-industrial, or whatever is in front of us now with automation. But I wonder that that whole distinction between laboring and work, if that's also reflective of like this times of Aristotle. There's a class, I guess, a class distinction. That those are the aristocrats, they're exempt, and they are also seen as the thinkers, or they're the ones allocated to make it the decisions, and then the laboring ones are just the ones that do the labor. I don't know if it simplifies it too much.
yeah, right. So
Uh,
the thinkers, so those include the politicians, but then also the intellectuals, right? So but then also the artists, right? So any great
yeah.
piece of art, music, or poems, novels, um,
Mhm.
things that like they are relevant over many generations, right? Um, like the fact that we still read about Aristotle and we can recognize his name and Plato and Socrates and so forth. Um,
Don't forget Machiavelli.
right. While yeah, Machiavelli, while all the people that were feeding
Uh,
those, let's say, philosophers or politicians and aristocrats, they are not remembered. Right. So if you remember the Bertolt Brecht, when he was saying who built the wall of Thebes, I think, which was one of his his poems, right?
mhm.
Um, and and he says, well, it's not the people whom it's named after, right? Right. So it's not, so in the Egyptian case, right? It wouldn't be the pharaoh, the king, right? Who would, you know, build, the wall, or who would build the tombs for the pharaohs. Um, but it would be built by ordinary people, by the slaves, effectively, right? Slaves of that society. And they are not remembered. I mean, it's the same thing like nowadays, like if you go to college campuses, right? When you go
Mhm.
to these buildings, to these halls that are named after usually the big donors to that university, right? You have like the big plaque, right? It's like the shape of the face, right? Of that donor, uh, greeting you at the entrance, right? Or like usually like a portrait that would hang in the wall. Um, yeah, as I say, it's the same principle, right? I mean, it's like we're not going to remember the names of the construction workers that created the building, right? Uh, it's named after the donors, right? Even though, I mean, in terms of the effort, I mean, what was the donor doing, right? I mean,
Mhm. The actual work of constructing it. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I mean, the donor was signing the check, right? That's what he did. that was their effort, right? And they shook the hands with the president of the university, right? Um, uh, 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 but then, yeah, the actual work, right? It's the construction workers that we don't remember. Um, Now, so right, I mean, so if you of course are Marxist, so you sort of take that, and you're like, well, it's unfair, it's unjust, and we should create a system where it's like everything is fair. Um, and so I agree with the Marxist sentiment, but I just wanted to, because I come from this post scarcity, automation and
Oh yeah,
UBI kind of you could say
fully
ideological
automated luxury,
spectrum.
fully automated luxury society. You know.
Communism, that's right. Yeah, that's Aaron
Yeah.
Bastani. Well, basically, my take is that yeah, it's not. It's so the important takeaway for me is that you know there shouldn't be glorification of labor, right? Um, in a sense that if it can be automated, it should be right. Um, what we should instead ask for is for everybody to become an aristocrat, and that's a monumental challenge, right? Because um, in human history, I mean, we have never really been able to build it up. I mean, um, I have to be quite frank. I mean, while I've been a PhD student, I mean, I was living an aristocratic lifestyle, right? Um, not an aristocratic spending style, right? I mean, so obviously, I wasn't living in a big mansion, you know, with like private jet and everything else, right? And maids and servants. Um, but but in terms of my time allocation, I was kind of an aristocrat, right? Um, and many that were pursuing, you know, graduate degrees, they have that feeling too. I mean, like for instance, I mean, like if you're like in MBA or MPA program, right? Which is quite interesting because when you talk to the people over there, um, like these are not academic degrees, right? So these are not PhDs, so you're not supposed to, well, or you're not having to learn like research skills in the way that PhD students would. So then, what's the point of these programs? I mean, it's basically a break from the work that you would normally do. So if you're an MPA student, you probably worked in the policy field somewhere, like for government agency, or you worked for like a nonprofit organization or something. Um, if you're doing an MBA, you probably worked for a company for a couple of years. Um, so then you're in a master's program, and then you graduate 2 years later with a diploma in your hand. So then you go back to the old employer, you seek for a new employer, but with higher pay, right? Because you got the MBA or the MPA now, right? Um, but aside from the pay bump, I mean, the main idea is like, well, so there's two parts to it. So it's about networking. Basically, you hang out with other future employers, or
Business cards, yeah.
yeah, you're switching business cards, etc. And then the second thing is like you're having a good time. I mean, to be quite frank, I mean, so I got this public policy program here in Princeton, and I didn't notice, but apparently a lot of the master students there, I mean, they have very good parties, apparently, right? So they party regularly. Which if you're like a PhD student, you don't do that, right? I mean, well, sometimes they do, but very rarely, right? I mean, it's like our life is quite serious, actually. I mean, right? Because we're supposed to produce these research papers and things like that, right? So, yeah, and then this whole idea of, I mean, just taking a break from the actual working. Um, right, but I guess the main idea is like this is the ideology of the leisure society that
Yeah.
some people are able to live out for a particular period of time, right? Um, and the right and the complications, well, how do you how do you make how do you universalize that? And we're still learning about it. Um,
Trying to remember the son-in-law of Marx, Paul Leverg, the right
Lafargue,
to be lazy. Is that his name? So
Lafargue.
the right to be lazy. I think that was the theme of his book, which is really a small pamphlet. But this whole idea that lazy, that everybody needs leisure time, and historically the working class have been denied that. And in his time, there was this problem of workers didn't have vacation time or free time. Of course, in the 21st century, we kind of think of it as, there's some protection, there's legal protection, there's sleep time, but for the most part, I mean, a lot of people working in retail, uh, yeah, it's a tough job, it's tough work, it's strain on the body, and so you're right. I mean, it's people that may be in the academic fields, there's a little degree of privilege, uncertainty. There's no uncertainty in their fields, but there's still a little privilege. They have free time, they have autonomy, they can cultivate their minds, right? They do different kind of work, but in certain different sectors, especially like retail, yeah, there's this there leisure is something very scarce, and that's oftentimes why people leave. The turnover rates are so horrible, including nursing fields, because of the lack of leisure time. They just can't get time off. And so that's a scarce thing. So, and that might be a question for the 21st century, if we reach this post-scarcity uh, society or post-scarcity economy, that leisure is very fundamental for citizenship rights too, I think. Some people say you have time to sleep, you have time to relax. For Germans and French, I know that's a big thing. All the holidays they get. I always have my relatives, they always tell me, all the holidays that they get over. And then maternity leave, things like this, which is common in a lot of European countries. But still this American exceptionalism where you just don't have that much leisure time, paid leisure time, right?
Yeah,
If
the
you're
flip side is that, if you look at innovation, the innovation sphere, I mean, America has most of that still. If you look at yeah, total income, I would say that it's probably higher over here than it is over there. So yeah, things come at a cost to us over here. I mean, certainly physical, emotional cost of extra labor, but then you know, there's some positive flip side to that, of course, to having a more capitalistic mindset. But I'm not sure. I mean, like, I have a feeling like the civilization is kind of backfiring. I mean, so that brings us full circle to the first topic, which is about the electric cars.
Yeah.
Namely, how sustainable is the climate? Given like the latest article you sent me, right, which was about the correlation
Oh,
between GDP and CO2, right? Where there's a clear positive correlation. But then the conundrum is that, the higher the GDP is, the greater the life satisfaction. Of course, it plateaus eventually, but I think at $20,000 per capita. But that's the thing. I mean, if you're like a poor country, I mean, you start, let's say, at 500 per capita, right? And you want to get up to 20,000, let's say, right? And that's an initiative that I would strongly endorse, right? Because you want the poor countries to catch up with the rich countries to some extent. Um, we're then pushed into a conundrum, however, where the current increases in the GDP in the developing countries is still based on the extraction and the burning of fossil fuels to a large extent. I mean, there's, of course, an energy transition that is underway, but maybe at the beginning, those renewable energy technologies are not being employed at wide scale in the developing countries.
Mhm.
Um, so that's the first limitation where it's like the development, carbon trade-off. And then the second issue is whether or not we are able to convince the rich countries to become um, a little bit less rich, let's say, and not
Mhm.
become outright poor, but certainly do without the uh, you know uh, carbon intensive lifestyle. And we are we're struggling certainly on both counts. Um, but it does raise a big question, I think, normatively. Like, does it make sense to push, efficiency and productivity standards to ever higher levels? I mean, from a normative perspective, the answer might be no. I mean, from a capitalist perspective, the answer is always yes, right? I mean, we always want more,
Mhm.
right? But from a normative perspective, perhaps, um, having more is not being better off, right?
Yeah. Which,
Um,
yeah, raises serious dilemma because if you think of the logic of the American dream and prosperity and growth, it's always been a landmark of American exceptionalism. I mean, it's driven capitalism, at least in the West. But yeah, it raises real questions, the ecological damage and the limitations that are there. So I don't know what comes first. The culture must readapt, or the state is a mechanism. The economic forces, or infrastructure socialism. I don't know how you would attempt to, you know, make people realize the ecological limitations that we face. We just can't have unlimited growth. It's just not possible. We have a finite planet and we have limited resources. So that means you have to sometimes ban things, and that scares libertarians, and people that identify as libertarians. Well, I have some friends of mine that are like libertarians, but sometimes you have to ban certain things. You have to ban combustion engine, like and I know it sounds like ecological dictatorship, but uh, it may have to be done. They may have to ban it. They may have to ban it for the sake of you know, uh, I guess the consideration of the future. But then again, the question is with the developing world. I mean, if the West is the model, and everybody thinks, well, if Germany does it, will it trickle down? And they don't have green movements or environmental conscious movements, not as much as we think of in the West. And what will happen to, you know, different regions of the world where they also, not adopt a Western kind of lifestyle
yeah, that's
and
right.
that's a big question, ban the combustion engine. I mean, I don't know if that's, you know, possible in all countries, especially
Well,
poor
it will
countries.
eventually happen, right? I think that there's a lot of pressure for that to
Yeah.
happen. There's a book by Ulrike Herrmann, I think.
Oh yeah. Well, we can't have on. Yeah.
I forgot the title of it, but anyway, the main argument is that a country as rich as Germany should be living like 1978 or something, right? It's really going back in time over 40 years. And she makes a few exceptions. I think she says owning a smartphone is okay, right? Which of course did not exist back in the 70s.
Yeah.
But yeah, but for instance, like her example is like vacation. So back in the 70s, you would basically, you know, drive to, Italy, to the coast or something, right? Like instead of flying to, Australia or something like that, right? For your
Yeah.
vacation, um you would just drive to locations that are, you know, maybe one day of driving away, right? And then the carbon impact would still be much less than, taking an airplane, right? Um, so those are certainly some of the uh, options that exist.
Yeah.
Um,
And Ulrike Hamann is, like reduction of, I mean, just what we do, everyday activities, and including how much we consume. And so, yeah, you followed all her debates. I mean, you're pretty knowledgeable about it just as much as I am. But again, that would be really radical. I mean, that would questioning the autonomy of decisions of consumers. If consumption has to be curtailed, that means you have to ban things, you have to restrict, and that would be Big Brother. I mean, the state would. I don't see it any other way. If voluntarily corporations are not going to do it, and I don't know how you would convince people. Like you would have to do resocialization. You'd have to encourage environmental kind of consciousness. I don't know. I mean, it took in Germany like 20, 30 years for the Greens to make it to the Bundestag, right? Or to become a significant player in German government. But they were marginalized, minority kind of movement. But think of how, I mean, they progressed. I mean, it's amazing if you think about it. Greens were just like a small little faction of people in 1981 or 82, I think. I think the same thing in Austria. In Austria, the Greens were kind of small, tiny activists. But
yeah,
Ulrike Erdmann belongs to that crowd, that early 70s, 60s eco kind of crowd.
yeah. I mean, certainly this kind of logic is extraordinarily appealing to some groups. I mean,
Youth.
to reduce your carbon footprint, to ecological footprint. But I think um
Yeah.
it's going to be the way how it's going to happen, I think, is you need to have actual scarcities, you need to have actual emergency situations, and then extraordinary measures are being taken, right? So if you, for instance, before the pandemic, right? I mean, if you had said, the government has the right to lock down the country and require people to get vaccinated as a condition of their job. There's various kind of basically anti-civil liberty measures, right? Um, from one day to the next, because of the exigencies of the pandemic, have become acceptable overnight almost,
Yeah.
right? So extraordinary situations, when it usually is about survival, right? They usually jolt people into action to do things that they don't like to do. I mean, I'm sure if you do like a survey of the Ukrainian population, right? I mean, on the 24th of February last year, I mean, I'm sure most of them would be like, no, I don't want to fight a war. I think, war is terrible, we could all die from it, right? Um, yeah, but nonetheless, I mean, as soon as, I think after the first day of the war, right, this iconic, video footage of, President Zelensky, right, with his cabinet assembled behind him on his like smartphone camera, he was saying that, that he would stay in Kiev and encourages all the people to continue fighting the resistance against the Russian invasion. Um, and and the public reacted quite positively to it. So I mean, it's really the extraordinary circumstances that are making people do things they don't want to do. And I think, and so right now with the climate change, I mean, it's quite like it's getting more serious now. I mean, I mean, so the New York Times just yesterday published a chart about the uh, extreme drought and extreme wetness, like extreme rainfall and things like that, severity. And I would say after 2018, you see a spike in extreme weather conditions. Um, and it's like we only see the foretaste of it, so it's not really that bad so far. Um, but as it, but if it progressively gets worse, I think there will be a much sharper reaction. Right? I mean, if you said like 5 years ago, right? I mean, there wasn't even a debate about the combustion engine phasing out, right? And then it went from it being, I mean, within a very short time frame, it went from like like a Green Party wet dream to you know reality, basically. I mean, government policy, right? Um, and like those things, I mean, they're moving quite fast. I mean, so
Yeah.
again, we're back to the Bauman's liquid society, right? It's like the
Hmm.
fact that I mean,
Really fast.
all that is solid melts into air, and then but it's not just that. It's also the speed at which you know this liquidization is happening, right? Um,
I have to admit, Bauman is a philosophical abstract, is an abstract concept, just like most sociological concepts. I mean, they have this uh, abstractness to it, which are useful, and then you can try to relate to it. And it's the same buzzword when you use the word risk society. I was always obsessed with this word, and I was trying to how do you relate to it, and what did the author originally think, and the danger though with a lot of these abstract concepts is self-fulfilling prophecies that they become circular uh, hypotheses. You know, I guess I don't know where I'm going with this.
yeah, but
I
as long as they have predictive value, I think
Yeah,
it's
no,
good
no, no,
enough.
I'm with you there. They can explain social phenomenon, and um, what I was trying to go is with this, concern about ecological problems and global problems in the world. I can see that there are different types of rationalities that people construct and institutions depend on historically. And I actually like using Weber's additional four type. You're probably familiar with the four type, right? The instrumental rationality, the traditional, the emotional, and I can't remember the last one. There's like four, but I think the problem has been that when it came to ecology, we usually had this instrumental rationality which we were using, and we had this kind of cost benefit analysis, and we really thought about money and profit, and that dictated often even our policy towards the environment. And to this day, I mean, if you look at public opinion data from World Values Survey, they have one survey question in there where they ask people, "What do you prefer? Lots of jobs, uh, or horrible environmental policy, or would you prefer less jobs but great environmental policy?" So I think that would reflect the divide, at least, how people either adopt certain kinds of rationalities. If they think more in terms of money and interest, then the economic policies suffer. So I could see it happening to where a poor country will sacrifice environmental.
You mean environmental policies will suffer. If you're
Yeah,
capitalistic, then environmental policies
yeah.
suffer. Yeah.
What's interesting though is, um, let's say if people are increasingly cynical and they really don't care, and it's neither something that's based purely on cost benefit. It's not something based on religion, because sometimes religion can be beneficial, because sometimes religious people think they want to protect the environment. They think it's something God's work, and then but people that are increasingly cynical worry, Larry, I really worry about uh cynical rationality destroys sincerity. And this is where you get this response where people say, drill baby drill, they irrational, totally irrational. And I worry that that kind of rationality is used sometimes by populists or populist kind of thoughts that simplify it to where people don't care after a while, and they are not educated, or maybe they don't want to be educated about the whole process of global warming. And the quickest way is just to kind of be cynical about it. And so that's the thing I worry about. That could be a dangerous state if it turns into a joke. And that, I mean, think about it, future generations, and the livelihood of a planet, And I can at least we know with instrumental rationality, we know that they're using a kind of capitalist mentality, cost benefit, But when it comes to different types, even emotional rationality, I don't know how that would work in environmental calculations. Of course, environmental activists sometimes are very emotional, you know, and that was a criticism, by the way, in Germany in the last generation. There were a lot of conservative politicians that would say, uh, these young people are too radical, they're too emotional. Why are they gluing their hands on the highways? They never viewed as irrational. But they did have a message. I mean, they were saying that we are the last generation, you know.
Well, it's
But
about raising attention, right? That's
yeah,
probably why they do it this way.
yeah, yeah.
Because
Social movement. Go ahead.
because the thing with the Fridays for Future started, was it 4 or 5 years ago, right? But I think the activists, they think that that strategy is exhausted, right? Because Fridays for Future, right? So what do you do? Okay, so I don't go to school on Friday. I go for the climate protest. Um, and then and then the
Sounds like
politicians and the politicians, they sort of get used to that, right? So it's like, oh yeah, whatever. I mean, at the beginning, they're like, remember when Angela Merkel was meeting Greta Thunberg, right?
yeah,
Shaking hands with her and whatever, and then photo opportunity. Um, but and then the politicians shrug their shoulders, and then business as usual, right? And it feels like now they get to the point where it's like, okay, well, if we do Fridays for Future, we're not gonna
you gotta be
raise the
more.
eyebrows anymore. So
Yeah,
they have to take it one step further, right? So now we
last
have to
generation.
glue ourselves somewhere, and then maybe the next radical step would be like self-immolation,
Yeah.
which maybe I shouldn't suggest this in public because it will give them bad
No, no,
ideas.
it can turn fundamentalistic. I mean, I think ecological movements can become radicalized. They could, just like any political movement could, you know. You agree or disagree? I mean, yeah, you could think extremely, and um, I think there was a case, tree huggers, no, tree squatters, which is they were just squatting in trees, but they were doing it for months and years, right?
So they were
Um,
they were living on the tree basically. It's like,
yeah, as a form of political protest, famous case in the United States. I think it happened in California, and then other activists did the same thing in Germany. That was actually a recent case. They squatted in trees and in buildings of a small village for a couple of months till they were forcibly evicted. But yeah, I mean, there are tactics, sometimes tactics like that cause attention. But this is what I was getting at, the different rationalities. Like, for the activists, it's a combination of political and it's also like emotional. But then for the business type, for the business interest, that's purely market, purely instrumental. But the worry I have is the cynic, this I call it the cynical kind of rationality that starts to also play a role where there's just it's a big joke, or there's no sincerity in any environmental policy. So that could be risky. You don't have to have some uh, competing political groups that have different views on environment, but as soon as you have cynicism enter into it, it's one big joke.
right. So basically, the opposite of cynicism to you would be good faith, right? So it's
Yeah,
basically about the belief that, okay, we might have disagreements about, how to get to a better place, to a better society, um, the means of getting there, but at least we agree that there should be a good society, right?
yeah,
And that we should work towards, right? There's a
yeah,
conservative approach, there's a liberal approach to it, right?
yeah.
Left wing, right wing, um, but
Even libertarian.
or libertarian approach to it. But I think that what you're talking about is cynicism in society, which we see, um, you know, even more broadly. Like if you think about the Trump phenomenon. So I was listening to this Sam Harris podcast, and you can definitely tell like how traumatized he is about Trump, because everything he does is sort of like turned off by Trump. Um, but he's talking about among the Trump supporters, right? Especially those that are radicalized within online communities. Like think of Reddit forums or Twitter, right? Or Truth Parlor, whatever their own social media network is. Um, and what keeps the attention of many of the people that are within the Trump circle, which includes QAnon, not exclusive, but it includes that group. Um, it is, I mean, like if you consider like the the conspiracy theories that are advanced by QAnon, are totally unreasonable, right? So there's no evidence for that, right? I mean, um, like for instance, I mean, the Democratic Party consists of like a child prostitution ring or something like that, right? Um, right. So is it basically claims that have zero truth value, right? Um, and then the question, I mean, like sociologists, social psychologists, I guess, is like, do these people actually believe in those stories, those conspiracy theories? Um, or is it about this idea of there's this idea of blue lies, right? Where it's like everybody knows that we're lying, but we're all telling the lie collectively to show that we are part of the group. Right?
Or
So it's
gaslighting? You mean gaslighting?
no,
Or
no, it's a blue lies, which is I mean, some
okay,
social psychologists came up with that term.
okay,
Um, because so in a white lie, it's about making the other side feel better or something like that. I think that's where the white lie is. I'm not sure, but a blue lie is if you are signaling that you're a member of the community, right? Um, but then there's this other point that Sam Harris made, which is the point that you made about cynicism, which is, you know, not that the QAnon members are fully behind believing in that particular conspiracy, but rather that there's so much frustration, so much anger, so much disappointment about the political system that they feel like is marginalizing that group of people, right? The unheard, the voiceless people, right? At least that's a self perception, right? That it's just like, I don't know. And that anger expresses itself by, I mean, think of this metaphor of like burn down the building, right? So to that
Mhm.
extent, I mean, the idea of like okay, storming the Capitol, right? Like January 6th, right? Um, like overthrowing the government, and those crowds cheering it on, right? Because, well, first of all, there was the adrenaline of the moment, right? Like as soon as you see like the first group of people storming the Capitol, entering the Capitol building, then you get the adrenaline rush, like the people standing outside, and then they push forward, right? They're like, yeah, this is a magic moment, like the storming of the Bastille, right? We have to go in. So that's the adrenaline of the moment. But then
Yeah.
also fundamentally like the cynicism, right?
Yeah.
About the political system. It's like, well, these people are holding me down. These people are ignoring me, you know, whoever that is, like Joe Biden or Nancy Pelosi or whoever. Um, and therefore, if this building were to burn down, who cares, right? I mean, and that cynicism is very bad for. I mean, it's not just a democratic system, right? Small d democratic system, right? It's also about yeah, the broader institutions that make up, you know, American society. Because I mean, if you don't have belief in the common institutions,
Yeah.
and you say, well, you might as well burn everything down. But I mean,
That's
I'm not sure whether you can actually hold that belief fully, right?
I think that's the essence of the critique, that cynical reason can never be reason. That cynical rationality is not a rationality. And the belief that people have is they think that being cynical about certain things and including their emotions. So I would put these two combinations together. So it's cynical rationality treated as rationality. That's where the problem lies. And I think this is, if and also I would come from a direction like Kaufman, at some point, when people are putting up this cynical front stage,
Kaufman.
uh yeah, Kaufman, Irving Kaufman, like they're putting on a cynical front stage. You can tell it's deceptive and you can tell it's insincere and you can sort of start to tell the consequences of using cynical reason as reason. um, Highly problematic. I would prefer than traditional rationality. I would prefer even an instrumental rationality that somebody uses if it's totally economic, or even But this is very. I think it's dangerous because then anything can go. As soon as you cross the line that cynicism is a rationality for you, then it can where else can it stop? You know, I think
Yeah.
there's a German book that I was reading about 2, 3 weeks ago. Trying to remember the name of the German. It was Unmenschlichkeit als Programm. Yeah, als Programm. Inhumanity as a political platform. If you translated it, that becomes people's rationality. That you really turn humanity upside down, and you think you can be barbaric, and you think that's a rationality. That's your punchline, if you like.
Yeah,
Uh,
and it's not just anti-democratic, it's anti, you know, uh planet, whatever. It's also anti-life, right? I mean, if you think of it, if let's say everybody were to agree right now to be a complete cynic about the system, right? Which, I mean, if you think about, I mean, even some of the stuff that we're doing, right, which is like advancing like the bullshit job theorem, right? Which is, it's a great degree of cynicism about our,
professions.
social institutions, the professions that we work in, etc. And of course, I would put a big question mark about whether we academics should put ourselves in that camp or
Mhm.
not. Given the you know amount of papers that we write that very few people read and things like that, right? Um, but I mean, but you see, the thing is that, okay, so if you have a few people who are, you know, critical intellectuals, including being cynics, right? Being very cynical about the system. Um, like you think of like the Noam Chomsky's of the world, right? Regarding like the U.S. foreign policy stance, for instance, is actually okay, right? And if it's actually formulated by intellectuals, like a real intellectual cynic, um, is still to be preferable to, let's say, a common man cynicism, you could say, right? Which
Yeah.
is much less, how should I say, um, intellectually defensible. It's like you cannot defend it based on the rational argumentation, right? Or coherent logic, right?
Mhm.
Um, then the common man cynicism is ultimately it is self-destructive in a certain way, right? It's about destroying, undermining society, and that's not that is not good. It cannot turn into anything constructive, right? Because even if you think that, okay, bullshit jobs, you can turn it into something positive, right? Like if you remember the last pages where Graeber writes, we need UBI, right? And he cites the people who are doing bullshit jobs who are advocating that program too. Um, so so intellectual cynicism, yes, you can turn it into something positive. Um, the Noam Chomsky version is like, well, just stop the foreign wars, right? Turn it into something positive, right?
Mhm.
But the common man cynicism where it's like, oh, I don't believe in anything. I don't believe in anything anymore. And then it's very tough because and I've encountered like right wing friends. I mean, like Trump supporters. And I noticed that, like, because in my mind, like, I'm always thinking about the reasons, right? So if they offer an argument, then I'm like, okay, let me find a reason to go, to stand up to them, right?
Yeah.
Um and but at that point, like, if you have this common man cynicism, I think it gets to the point where, as you say, I mean, you don't call it reason anymore, right? So, and I would agree with that because they're not receptive to reason.
Yeah, the
And
communication shuts down at that point, I think. Right? That's the
yeah,
deal with
so
cynicism. It is putting in question the whole purpose of a discussion in the first place, because everything can be undermined and everything has no relevance to the person. Uh, or and I think if you want to go further with this, Peter Sloterdijk, he wrote The Critique of Cynical Reason. That was his book in the 80s. Uh, I This is a big theme in philosophy, cynical reason as used as reason. And we can see it play out in populist movements, in extreme discourses and conspiracy theorists, and You know, so it's something we see. We see cynical reason used as reason, as a rationality, and people think it's a rationality. Now, the good thing with us, I mean, we at least we understand a different maybe levels of rationality that people might make. Again, we're not able to read people's minds, but based off of people's statements, we can interpret their form of rationality, at least what they're using as a way to explain things. Right. I mean,
Yeah,
there
but
maybe
as I
there's
said,
others. Yeah,
there's a
maybe
big
there's others. I mean, Weber originally had four. I was kind of, a couple like it was something like 2 days ago. I was kind of like thinking, okay, is there such a thing as a risk rationality? You know, I mean, you can go on. Is it intellectual rationality? Is it like you can go on? I mean, you could potentially think of rationality takes a form and it's expressed, in Weber's sense, it was either in economic form, in a traditional form, in an affectionate form, and I can't remember the fourth one. I keep forgetting the fourth one, but it's really systematic, and it's really systematic, and as a as sociology kind of thinkers, I wonder if there's a cultural rationality that's often used too, um, besides these other ones that we discussed, you know. But that could be a book somebody could write. It won't be me, but I think it'd be a great book, you know. But I hope the cynicism does raise serious issues, and what ramifications it has for political debate too, and right. So we deal with that.
yeah. I mean, it's like, I mean, again, if it's common man's cynicism, I mean,
Yeah.
there's not much to be done about that. I mean, um, you see, the trouble is that we fail to be able to create a coherent narrative, right? So I'm reminded
Mhm.
of the Alistair McIntyre claim. So he was a political philosopher. He was writing about after virtue, I think in 1981, um, and he's sort of attacking this sort of Enlightenment project because of their moral relativism, right? Because they sort of lack sort of like a unified account of you know things like progress and virtue, like things that everybody would sort of uniformly agree upon. Um, and you know, and if you have too much of this moral relativism, then you cannot create a coherent community. Because I mean, a community. I mean, if you think about the most ideologically coherent community in human societies, are religious communities. And so normally, like if you, I don't know, like Swiss Mennonites, right, who where the people are still wearing like peasant clothing of like 17th century or something, right? Um, where you well, I mean, as from a Western modern standpoint, you would be like, okay, these people are from yesterday, but then the flip side of it is that they do have very clear moral standards, right? It's like a moral community that is held together. I mean, and the clothing is just, and the practices and the jobs, right? Is like, which is farming, is just one expression, right? Um, of that moral community. And also the rituals, right? The church service, right? And and then of course, Weber talks about die Entzauberung der Gesellschaft, also so the disenchantment of society,
Yeah.
um, where the idea is so people are turning away from religion, and it's quite interesting because Weber spent a lot of his time studying religion, right? Sociology of religion. It's a big part of his way of study. And yeah, so people are turning away from religion over time, you know, and then people are becoming more secular. And then along with secular, it's like individualistic, right? So it's almost like secularization, you know, and the rise of capitalism, like the money economy, is non-divorceable from
Yeah, there's a little
individualization.
bit.
And that, you know, individualization, like the lack of basically a morally cohesive community, um, that itself is a well, the end result is going to be anomie, right? So that's the big concern, right? Um, and then you open the door for cynicism. So so if
Yeah.
you think about it, I mean,
Larry, I'm gonna have to quit in a little bit. I think my roommate's hearing us too loud. I can
uh,
bring it down. Oh, let me check. I might be able to bring it down. Yeah, no. Can you bring your voice down a little bit? Maybe.
um, okay, well, okay, okay, we'll call
Yeah,
it to an end for today. But
yeah. Hey, it
it is
was
a very
good.
fruitful topic, and it requires
I
certainly
couldn't stop
more
the volume.
chats
The
in the
volume was
future.
Yeah,
Okay,
it was good.
thank you.
I had a great time.